Hey everyone, tonight we're exploring something that might just blow your mind. The dreams that literally rewrote the spiritual playbook for billions of people across human history. I'm talking about those incredible, world-shaking visions that didn't just change individual lives, but actually transformed entire religious traditions and created belief systems that are still guiding humanity thousands of years later. You know what's absolutely wild? Some of the most influential spiritual movements in human history, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, can trace their origins back to somebody having a really intense dream. We're talking about nocturnal visions so powerful that they convinced people to completely abandon their old gods, start new religions, and sometimes even die for beliefs that came to them while they were unconscious. Before we dive into these mind-bending stories, here's my usual request. If you're actually enjoying these late-night journeys into the weird corners of human experience, maybe give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing. But only if this stuff genuinely fascinates you, you know? Also, I'd love to hear where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. There's something beautiful about our global community of insomniacs exploring these mysteries together. And listen, if you find yourself nodding off at some point during this, that's totally fine. Actually, that's kind of what we're going for here. Though I have to warn you, some of these religious dream stories are so absolutely extraordinary that they might actually keep you wide awake just trying to wrap your head around how they changed the course of human civilization. Tonight we're diving into visions that split empires, dreams that launched crusades, and nocturnal revelations that convinced people they were talking directly to the divine. Because here's the thing about religious dreams, they don't just happen to individuals. They happen through individuals to transform entire cultures and reshape how humanity understands the sacred. Dreams don't just visit prophets, they create them. And sometimes they create the very foundations of faith that billions of people still follow today. Let's start with what might be the single most politically consequential dream in human history. The night before the Battle of Novian Bridge in 312 AD, when Roman Emperor Constantine had a vision that not only changed his life, but literally made Christianity the dominant religion of the Western world for the next 1,700 years. And when I say this dream changed everything, I mean it transformed Christianity from an illegal underground cult into the official religion of the most powerful empire on earth. Picture this. It's October 27th, 312 AD. And Constantine is camped outside Rome with his army, facing off against his rival Maxentus for control of the Roman Empire. This isn't just any political dispute, this is winner takes all for the most powerful position in the known world. The victor becomes absolute ruler of territories stretching from Britain to the Middle East, commanding legions that could crush any opposition. The loser becomes a very dead former emperor whose head will probably end up on a spike. Now, you have to understand the context here. Constantine is seriously outnumbered. Maxentus has somewhere around 100,000 troops defending Rome, while Constantine has maybe 40,000 soldiers who've just completed an exhausting march across the Alps. Military strategists today still argue about how Constantine thought he could possibly win this battle. His advisors were probably suggesting strategic retreats, negotiated settlements, anything other than a direct assault on Rome itself. But Constantine is also dealing with massive psychological pressure that goes beyond just military calculations. He's not just fighting for political power, he's fighting for legitimacy in a system where emperors were supposed to be divinely appointed representatives of the gods. Roman imperial ideology required rulers to demonstrate that they had divine favor through military victory, successful governance, and the support of traditional religious institutions. The problem is that Constantine has been showing disturbing signs of religious uncertainty that would have horrified traditional Romans. While he hasn't openly converted to Christianity, he's been suspiciously tolerant of Christians in territories under his control, and he's shown less enthusiasm for traditional Roman religious ceremonies than previous emperors. Some of his generals are already whispering that he might have lost the favor of Mars, Jupiter, and the other gods who were supposed to guarantee Roman military success. Constantine is probably spending the night before the battle wondering if he's made a catastrophic mistake. He's alienated traditional Roman religious authorities without fully committing to Christianity. He's facing impossible military odds against an enemy who controls the symbolic and strategic heart of the empire. And he's about to discover whether the gods, whoever they might be, actually favor his claim to imperial power. But then Constantine has this dream. And not just any dream, a vision so vivid and specific that it convinced him to completely abandon the traditional Roman gods that his family had worshipped for generations and bet everything on a religious tradition that his empire had been systematically persecuting for 3 centuries. In his dream, Constantine sees a blazing cross of light stretching across the sky above his military camp, brighter than the sun and visible to his entire army. Written across this luminous cross are the words in hoc signo vinces. In this sign, conquer, in letters of fire that seem to burn themselves into his consciousness. The vision is accompanied by a voice that he understands to be Christ himself, commanding him to place this sign on his military standards and promising him victory in the coming battle. But the dream doesn't end there. Constantine also receives detailed instructions about how to create banners, incorporating the Christian Chiro symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ's name in Greek. He sees exactly how his soldiers should paint crosses on their shields, how to modify his personal battle standard to include Christian imagery, and even specific prayers that his troops should recite before engaging the enemy. When Constantine wakes up, he's absolutely convinced that the Christian God wants him to win this battle and become emperor. Now, you have to understand how psychologically revolutionary this was. Constantine wasn't a Christian. He hadn't been baptized. He hadn't studied Christian theology, and he probably couldn't quote a single verse from the New Testament. His empire had been persecuting Christians since the reign of Nero, treating them as dangerous radicals who refused to worship the emperor and threatened the stability of Roman society. For a Roman general to suddenly convert to Christianity on the eve of the most important battle of his life was like, imagine if a Chinese Communist Party leader suddenly announced he was becoming a born-again Christian and making it the official state religion. It would be seen as either insanity or treason, possibly both. But Constantine is so convinced by his dream that he does something that shocks everyone in his army. He orders his soldiers to paint Christian symbols on their shields and banners, replacing the traditional Roman eagles and images of Mars with crosses and the Chiro monogram. His generals probably thought he'd completely lost his mind. His centurions were probably terrified that they were about to get slaughtered because their emperor had offended all the traditional gods who were supposed to protect. Roman armies, the rank-and-file soldiers were probably even more confused. These were professional legionnaires who had spent their careers winning battles under the protection of Jupiter, Mars, and Minerva. Now their commander was telling them to abandon these proven gods in favor of the deity worshipped by people they'd been persecuting as enemies of the state. It would be like asking Navy SEALs to pray to Allah before a mission technically possible, but psychologically and culturally jarring. But Constantine is operating under the conviction that his dream was direct divine communication, and he's willing to stake everything, his life, his army, his claim to imperial power, on the reliability of this vision. He has his personal standard replaced with what becomes known as the Labarum, a banner featuring the Chiro symbol and a Latin inscription proclaiming his faith in Christ. Against all military logic and historical precedent, Constantine wins the Battle of Milvian Bridge decisively. His outnumbered forces smash through Maxentus's defensive lines, drive the enemy army back across the Tiber River, and kill Maxentus himself when he drowns trying to escape across a pontoon bridge that collapses under the weight of his retreating troops. Constantine becomes sole ruler of the Western Romang Empire, and within a year he'll control the entire empire after defeating his remaining rival, Licinius. But here's where one man's dream changes the course of human history. Constantine immediately begins implementing policies that transform Christianity from an illegal underground religion into the favored faith of imperial power. In 313 AD, Constantine issues the Edict of Milan, which legalizes Christianity throughout the empire and ends 3 centuries of intermittent but often brutal persecution. Christian prisoners are released from mines and prisons. Confiscated church property is returned, and Christians are allowed to practice their faith openly for the first time since the apostolic period. But Constantine goes much further than simple tolerance. He begins actively promoting Christianity through imperial patronage, funding the construction of magnificent churches, appointing Christians to high government positions, and even intervening in theological disputes to ensure church unity. The Basilica of St. John Lateran, built with Constantine's support, becomes the first monumental Christian architecture in history. The psychological impact on Constantine was just as dramatic as the political consequences. This dream didn't just make him emperor, it made him believe he was specifically chosen by the Christian God to rule the world and promote the true faith. He started calling himself the 13th Apostle, began participating in church councils despite never being officially baptized, and developed a highly personal relationship with Christ that influenced every aspect of his reign. Constantine's approach to Christianity was both genuine and politically savvy. He understood that Christians were a growing, well-organized minority that could provide crucial support for his rule, but his personal devotion seems to have been sincere based on his private letters and the consistency of his pro-Christian policies throughout his 30-year reign. The emperor also developed some fairly unusual theological ideas that worried Orthodox Christian bishops. He believed that his imperial authority came directly from Christ, that he had a special role in preparing the world for the Second Coming, and that the Roman Empire was divinely appointed to spread Christianity throughout the known world. These ideas created the foundation for what would later become the concept of Christian empire and the divine right of kings. Constantine even postponed his baptism until he was on his deathbed, based on his belief that the sacrament would wash away all his sins at once and guarantee his salvation regardless of anything he did as emperor. This allowed him to continue the brutal military campaigns and political executions that imperial rule required while still considering himself a faithful Christian. The impact on Christianity itself was equally revolutionary. Within a generation, Christianity goes from being an illegal underground religion to the official faith of the most powerful empire in the world. Churches start getting built with imperial funding in major cities throughout the empire. Christian bishops become political advisors and diplomatic ambassadors. Christian theology begins influencing Roman law and imperial policy. But the transformation wasn't entirely positive from a spiritual perspective. Many Christians worried that imperial patronage was corrupting the purity of their faith and turning the church into a political institution rather than a spiritual community. The radical teachings of Jesus about poverty, pacifism, and social equality became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the wealth and power that came with imperial support. The geographical impact was staggering. Christian missionaries, now backed by imperial resources and protection, spread rapidly throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Gothic tribes, Celtic communities, and Mediterranean trading networks all encountered Christianity as part of their political relationships with Rome. Constantine's dream also influenced the development of Christian art and symbolism in ways that still affect religious culture today. The cross, which had been a symbol of shame and execution, became a sign of divine power and imperial authority. Christian iconography began incorporating imperial symbols and Roman artistic styles, creating the visual vocabulary that would define Western religious art for over a millennium. The really wild part is that historians still debate whether Constantine had a genuine religious conversion or whether he was just a brilliant politician who realized that Christianity was growing rapidly and decided to co-opt it for political advantage. Contemporary sources suggest that Constantine himself never seemed to doubt that his dream was authentic divine communication, and his policies remained consistently pro-Christian even when supporting Christians created political difficulties. Some modern scholars argue that Constantine's vision might have been a genuine psychological or even neurological phenomenon, possibly a form of sleep paralysis, lucid dreaming, or even a seizure-related hallucination that he interpreted through the religious framework available to him. But regardless of the neurological explanation, the historical impact was undeniably real and lasting. The Battle of Milvian Bridge Dream literally reshaped the map of human civilization and cultural development. Without Constantine's vision, Christianity might have remained a small Middle Eastern sect that eventually died out or merged with other mystery religions. Instead, it became the foundation of European culture, the driving force behind the Crusades, the justification for colonial expansion throughout Africa and the Americas, and the dominant religious tradition of the Western world. Constantine's dream also established precedents for Christian political theology that influenced European politics for over 15 centuries. The idea that earthly rulers could receive direct divine guidance, that political power could serve religious purposes, and that empire could be a tool for spreading faith became central to medieval and early modern European political theory. The cultural legacy extends to everything from calendar systems, our dating from the birth of Christ, to legal principles. Many European legal codes still reflect Christian moral teachings to artistic traditions. Christian themes dominated Western art until the modern period to educational institutions. Most European universities were originally founded as Christian theological schools, but perhaps the most profound impact was psychological and spiritual. Constantine's dream demonstrated that individual religious experiences could have massive collective consequences, that personal visions could reshape entire civilizations, and that dreams could serve as vehicles for historical transformation that exceeded anything achievable through normal political processes. The irony is that Constantine's conversion may have saved Christianity from gradual decline while also transforming it into something very different from what Jesus and the early apostles had envisioned. The religion of the cross became the religion of the sword. The faith of the persecuted became the faith of the persecutors, and the gospel of peace became the ideology of empire. Modern Christians still grapple with the legacy of Constantine's dream, grateful for the survival and spread of their faith, but uncomfortable with the violence and political compromise that imperial Christianity involved. The Constantinian Revolution remains one of the most controversial and influential religious transformations in human history. When your dreams about divine symbols literally create the foundation for Western civilization and influence the spiritual lives of billions of people across 17 centuries, you're dealing with the kind of nocturnal vision that transcends individual psychology to become a force of historical change that continues to shape human culture, politics, and religious understanding today. Constantine's cross dream reminds us that sometimes individual, religious experiences can serve as hinges upon which the entire course of human history turns, transforming not just personal faith but the spiritual, cultural, and political landscape of entire civilizations in ways that continue to influence how we understand the relationship between divine will and earthly power. Now let's talk about what Muslims believe was the most important dream in human history, the night the Prophet Muhammad received his first revelation from the angel Gabriel, launching Islam and creating a religion that now has over 1.8 billion followers worldwide. And when I say this dream changed everything, I mean it literally created the fastest spreading religion in human history and reshaped the political, cultural, and spiritual landscape of 3 continents. Picture this, it's around 610 AD in the Arabian Peninsula, and Muhammad is a 40-year-old merchant living in Mecca, which at the time is basically a desert trading post that happens to house the Kaaba, an ancient cube-shaped shrine that contains hundreds of tribal idols and serves as a pilgrimage destination for various Arab tribes. Muhammad's not particularly religious by the standards of his time, but he's been having these increasingly intense spiritual experiences that are starting to worry his family and friends. Now, you have to understand the context here. Pre-Islamic Arabia was a rough place. Tribal warfare was constant. Social inequality was extreme, and religious practices often involved worshiping multiple gods through rituals that could include everything from poetry competitions to infanticide. Muhammad has been growing increasingly troubled by the social injustice he sees around him, the wealthy merchants exploiting the poor, the strong oppressing the weak, and the general moral chaos that seems to characterize his society. Muhammad has been spending more and more time alone in a cave called Hira on Mount Jabal al-Nur, about 3 miles outside Mecca, engaging in what Arabs called tahannuth, basically prolonged meditation and spiritual reflection. This wasn't unusual behavior for thoughtful people of his era, but Muhammad's spiritual seeking was becoming more intense and frequent. suggesting that he was wrestling with some serious existential questions about the nature of God, human purpose, and social justice. He's been having dreams and visions for months that he can't quite understand or interpret. Nothing dramatic or specific enough to change his life, but persistent spiritual experiences that suggest his consciousness is becoming more receptive to whatever forces govern religious revelation and mystical experience. Then, during what Muslims call Laylat al-Qadr, the night of power, Muhammad has the most terrifying and transformative dream of his life. He's sleeping in the cave when suddenly he's confronted by an angelic being of such overwhelming power and luminosity that it fills his entire field of vision and seems to threaten his sanity and survival. This isn't a gentle, comforting religious experience like you might see in Christian art or popular spiritual literature. This is violent, overwhelming, and completely outside anything Muhammad has ever experienced or imagined. The angel Gabriel, Jibril in Arabic, appears to him as a massive figure with 600 wings that stretch from the earth to the horizon, radiating light so intense that Muhammad thinks he might be going blind or losing his mind. Gabriel commands him to Iqra, read or recite, but Muhammad is illiterate like roughly 90% of people in 7th century Arabia. He has no idea how to read, and he certainly doesn't know what this terrifying angelic being wants him to recite. So he responds honestly, "I cannot read." But Gabriel doesn't accept this answer. The angel grabs Muhammad and squeezes him so hard that he can barely breathe, crushing him with superhuman strength until he thinks he's going to die, then releases him and commands again, "Read." Muhammad gasps out the same response. He can't read. He doesn't know how. He doesn't understand what's being asked of him. Gabriel crushes him again, even harder this time, holding him so tightly that Muhammad feels like his ribs are going to crack and his lungs are going to burst. When the angel releases him, Muhammad is shaking, gasping for air, and probably convinced that he's either being killed by a demon or suffering some kind of psychotic breakdown. The third time Gabriel commands him to read, something different happens. Instead of saying he can't, Muhammad somehow receives the first verses of what will become the Quran, words that seem to flow through him rather than from him. Iqra bismi rabbika alazi kalak, kalaka al-insana min alak, Iqra wa rabbuka al-akram. Read in the name of your Lord who created man from a clot of blood. Read, and your Lord is most generous. These words appear in Muhammad's consciousness in perfect Arabic poetry, with rhythms and linguistic structures that he's never heard before and couldn't have created with his limited education. The verses continue with concepts about divine knowledge, human learning, and the relationship between God and humanity that represent sophisticated theological insights. Muhammad wakes up absolutely terrified. This wasn't a pleasant spiritual experience or a comforting divine vision. It was violent, overwhelming, and completely beyond his control or understanding. He's convinced he's either going insane, being attacked by demons, or experiencing some kind of medical emergency that's causing hallucinations. He runs home to his wife, Khadijah, shaking uncontrollably and begging her to cover him with blankets because he's cold, scared, and probably in shock from what he believes might have been a psychotic episode or supernatural attack. Muhammad is a successful businessman who's used to being in control of situations, and this experience has reduced him to a terrified, confused man who doesn't know what's happening to his mind. But Khadijah, who was actually quite a bit older than Muhammad and had been a successful merchant herself before their marriage, recognizes that something spiritually significant has happened. She doesn't dismiss his experience as mental illness or demonic possession. Instead, she takes him to her cousin, Waraka ibn Nafal, who was a Christian scholar familiar with Jewish and Christian scriptures and traditions of prophetic revelation. Waraka listens to Muhammad's account of his terrifying dream encounter with Gabriel and immediately recognizes it as similar to the prophetic experiences described in Hebrew and Christian scriptures. He tells Muhammad that the angel who appeared to him was the same Gabriel who had brought revelations to Moses and Jesus, and that Muhammad has been chosen as a prophet for the Arabian people. This confirmation from a respected religious scholar helps Muhammad understand that his traumatic dream wasn't a sign of mental illness or demonic attack, but but rather divine communication that placed him in the tradition of biblical prophets. But it also means accepting that his life is about to change completely, that he's being called to challenge the religious, social, and political status quo of his society. From that night forward, Muhammad begins receiving regular revelations that will eventually become the Quran. But here's what's fascinating and often overlooked: these weren't pleasant, easy experiences. Muhammad described the revelation process as incredibly painful and disorienting, like having a bell ringing inside his head so loudly that it nearly drove him mad, or like being squeezed by invisible forces that made normal breathing and thinking almost impossible. The psychological impact on Muhammad was enormous and transformative. This dream experience converted him from a successful but unremarkable merchant into someone who believed he was the final prophet of God, chosen to deliver the last divine message to humanity before the day of judgment. He started preaching about monotheism, social justice, the importance of caring for orphans and the poor, and the need to prepare for divine accountability after death. But Muhammad's prophetic calling also created enormous personal and social stress. His message challenged the polytheistic religious traditions that supported Mecca's economy through pilgrimage tourism. His emphasis on social equality threatened the tribal hierarchies that maintained political stability. His claims about receiving divine revelation seemed blasphemous to people who believed their traditional gods were sufficient for spiritual and practical needs. The early Muslim community faced severe persecution in Mecca, including economic boycotts, physical violence, and social ostracism that forced many converts to emigrate to Abyssinia, modern Ethiopia, to escape harassment. Muhammad himself was threatened with assassination multiple times, and his followers were tortured and killed for abandoning traditional Arabian religious practices. The revelations that began with Muhammad's terrifying dream encounter with Gabriel eventually created a complete religious, legal, and social system that addressed everything from personal hygiene to international relations. The Quran includes guidance about marriage and divorce, business ethics, criminal justice, warfare, diplomacy, and spiritual practices that became the foundation for Islamic civilization. But the religious and political consequences extended far beyond the Arabian Peninsula. Within a century of Muhammad's first dream revelation, Islamic armies had conquered territories stretching from Spain in the west to India in the east, creating one of the largest empires in human history and spreading Islamic culture, law, and religious practices across 3 continents. The speed of Islamic expansion was unprecedented in world history. Within 30 years of Muhammad's death, Muslim forces had defeated the Byzantine and Persian empires, conquered Egypt and Syria, and established Islamic rule from Libya to Central Asia. This wasn't just military conquest, it was cultural and religious transformation that affected millions of people and hundreds of different ethnic and linguistic communities. Islamic scholars preserved and expanded upon Greek philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy during the European Dark Ages, creating universities and libraries that maintained scientific knowledge and promoted intellectual innovation. Islamic banks and trade networks connected Africa, Asia, and Europe in commercial relationships that facilitated cultural exchange and economic development. The ethical teachings that emerged from Muhammad's dream revelations influenced everything from medieval Christian theology to modern international law. Islamic concepts about religious tolerance, social welfare, and the rights of minorities became part of the legal and moral frameworks that shaped how diverse societies could coexist peacefully. But perhaps most significantly, Muhammad's dream revelations created a new model for understanding the relationship between divine will and human society. Islam emphasized that religious faith should manifest in social justice, that spiritual practice should include care for the vulnerable, and that divine revelation should guide both personal behavior and collective social organization. The Quran that emerged from Muhammad's continuing dream revelations includes some of the most sophisticated discussions of theology, ethics, and social organization in world religious literature. It addresses questions about free will and predestination, the relationship between reason and faith, the proper conduct of warfare, the rights of women and minorities, and the responsibilities of political leadership. Muhammad's approach to religious authority was also revolutionary. Unlike Christianity, which developed hierarchical structures of bishops and church institutions, Islam emphasized direct relationship between individuals and God, with religious scholars serving as interpreters rather than intermediaries. This democratized religious authority in ways that influenced political and social development throughout the Islamic world. The psychological sophistication of Islamic theology that emerged from Muhammad's dream revelations is often underappreciated in contemporary discussions. The Quran includes detailed analyses of human motivation, the sources of moral behavior, the relationship between individual psychology and social environment, and the ways that spiritual practices can promote both personal development and community welfare. Islamic legal traditions that developed from Quranic principles created some of the most advanced systems of jurisprudence in medieval world, including concepts about evidence and testimony, the rights of defendants, the limitations of government power, and the proper relationship between religious law and secular authority that influenced legal development throughout Europe and Asia. The mystical traditions within Islam, Sufism, developed sophisticated techniques for spiritual development and religious experience that influenced Christian mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, and eventually Western psychology and philosophy. Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafez created literature that continues to inspire people across religious and cultural boundaries. But Muhammad's dream revelations also created ongoing challenges and controversies that continue to affect Islamic communities today. Questions about the proper interpretation of Quranic teachings, the relationship between religious law and modern social conditions, and the role of religious authority and political governance remain sources of debate and sometimes conflict within Islamic societies. The sectarian divisions within Islam, particularly between Sunni and Shia communities, partly reflect different understandings of how Muhammad's prophetic authority should be continued and interpreted after his death. These theological disagreements have had enormous political and social consequences that continue to influence Middle Eastern and global politics. The really remarkable thing about Muhammad's first dream revelation is that it initiated a process of continuing spiritual communication that lasted 23 years and created a complete religious system that has guided over 1 billion people across 14 centuries. These dreams didn't just start a religion, they created a comprehensive blueprint for human civilization that addressed every aspect of individual and collective life. Modern Islamic scholarship continues to grapple with how to apply the principles that emerged from Muhammad's dream revelations to contemporary social, political, and ethical challenges. The process of ijtihad, independent reasoning about religious questions, attempts to extend prophetic guidance to modern circumstances while maintaining fidelity to the original revelations. The influence of Muhammad's dream revelations extends far beyond religious communities to affect global culture, politics, and intellectual development. Islamic contributions to mathematics, science, philosophy, art, and literature that emerged from Quranic principles continue to influence human knowledge and creative expression. Contemporary interfaith dialogue often focuses on the common elements between the revelations that Muhammad received in his dreams and the teachings found in Jewish and Christian scriptures. Many scholars recognize that these three Abrahamic traditions share fundamental insights about monotheism, social justice, and human moral responsibility that emerge from similar experiences of divine communication. The psychological and neurological study of religious revelation has been influenced by accounts of Muhammad's dream experiences, which provide detailed descriptions of the physical and mental phenomena associated with receiving what believers understand as divine communication. These accounts have influenced research into altered states of consciousness, mystical experience, and the relationship between spiritual practice and brain function. When your dreams about terrifying angelic encounters create a religion followed by nearly 2 billion people, establish legal and ethical systems that govern entire civilizations, and generate intellectual and cultural achievements that influence global human development across 14 centuries, you're dealing with the kind of nocturnal revelation that transcends individual psychology to become a force of historical transformation. Muhammad's first dream revelation reminds us that some religious experiences are so powerful and comprehensive that they reshape not just personal faith, but the spiritual, intellectual, and social foundations of human civilization in ways that continue to influence how billions of people understand their relationship with the divine, their responsibilities to each other, and their purpose in the world. The night of Muhammad's first revelation shows us that individual mystical experiences can serve as catalysts for collective transformation that affects art, science, law, politics, and culture across continents and centuries, demonstrating the profound connection between personal spiritual insight and the broader evolution of human consciousness and social organization. And let me tell you about what might be the most psychologically sophisticated religious dream in history, the night Prince Siddhartha. Gautama sat under a tree and had visions that would transform him into the Buddha and create a religion focused on ending human suffering through understanding the nature of consciousness itself. And when I say this dream revolutionized human thinking, I mean it created the first systematic psychology in human history and established meditation techniques that are still being validated by modern neuroscience today. Picture this, it's around 528 BC in northern India. And Siddhartha is a 35-year-old prince who has abandoned his life of luxury to become a wandering ascetic, searching for the solution to human suffering. This isn't some casual spiritual quest. Siddhartha has been trying every available religious practice for 6 years, pushing his body and mind to absolute extremes in his desperate attempt to understand why life involves so much pain and whether there's any way to escape the endless cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. Now, you have to understand what Siddhartha has been through to appreciate the psychological state he's in when he sits down under that Bodhi tree. He was born into the Shakya clan as a prince who was literally raised in a palace designed to shield him from any awareness of suffering, aging, sickness, or death. His father, King Suddhodana, had received a prophecy that his son would either become a great king or a great spiritual teacher. So he tried to prevent the spiritual path by surrounding Siddhartha with every possible luxury and pleasure. But when Siddhartha was 29, he managed to sneak out of the palace and encountered what Buddhists call the four sights: an old man, a sick person, a dead body, and a wandering monk. These experiences shattered his sheltered worldview and forced him to confront the reality that every human being, regardless of wealth or status, was subject to aging, illness, and death. The psychological impact was devastating. Everything he'd believed about life and happiness was revealed to be illusory. So Siddhartha abandoned his palace, his wife, his newborn son, and his guaranteed future as a king to become a homeless spiritual seeker. But this wasn't a gentle, gradual transition into religious life. Siddhartha threw himself into extreme ascetic practices that nearly killed him, fasting so severely that he became a walking skeleton, meditating until he passed out from exhaustion, and practicing breathing techniques that starved his brain of oxygen. He studied with the most advanced meditation teachers of his time, mastering techniques that could induce states of consciousness so profound that practitioners would remain motionless for days or weeks. He learned philosophical systems that analyzed the nature of reality, consciousness, and liberation with sophisticated logic and psychological insight. But none of these practices gave him the answers he was seeking about how to end suffering and escape the cycle of rebirth. By the time Siddhartha sits down under the Bodhi tree in the town of Bodh Gaya, he's been practicing extreme asceticism for 6 years and has become so thin that you can see his backbone through his stomach. His hair has fallen out, his skin is gray, and he's basically a living corpse who survived on a few grains of rice per day, while pushing his consciousness to states that most people would consider psychotic. But Siddhartha has also reached a crucial psychological insight. Extreme asceticism isn't working any better than extreme luxury. Starving his body and torturing his mind hasn't brought him any closer to understanding the nature of suffering or finding a path to liberation. He's starting to think that maybe enlightenment is impossible, that human beings are just doomed to cycle through birth, death, and suffering forever without any hope of escape. Then Siddhartha makes a decision that shocks his fellow ascetics and probably saves his life. He accepts some rice pudding from a village girl named Sujata, abandoning his extreme fasting and deciding to nourish his body properly before making one final attempt at enlightenment. His ascetic companions are horrified and abandon him, convinced that he's given up on the spiritual path in favor of worldly pleasures. But Siddhartha has developed a new approach based on what he calls the middle way, avoiding both extreme luxury and extreme asceticism in favor of balanced practices that support rather than torture consciousness. He sits down under a large fig tree, later called the Bodhi tree, the tree of awakening, and makes a vow that he won't get up until he either achieves complete enlightenment or dies trying. What happens next is unlike any other religious vision in recorded history. Instead of seeing angels, hearing divine voices, or receiving revelations from external supernatural beings, Siddhartha has a series of incredibly detailed psychological dreams that seem to reveal the fundamental structure of consciousness, karma, and reality itself. The first phase of his enlightenment experience involves what Buddhists call past life recall, visions of hundreds, then thousands, then millions of his previous incarnations stretching back through cosmic time. But these aren't random memories or pleasant fantasies. Siddhartha experiences every possible form of human and animal existence, living through the complete spectrum of conscious experience. He sees himself as kings and beggars, humans and animals, gods and demons, experiencing every form of joy and suffering that consciousness can endure. He lives through lives as insects eaten by predators, as predators hunting prey, as humans dying in wars, as peaceful monks achieving temporary liberation, as wealthy merchants obsessed with profit, as poor farmers struggling to survive famines. But what makes this vision psychologically revolutionary is that Siddhartha doesn't just remember these past lives, he understands the karmic connections between them. He sees how actions in one life create consequences that ripple through future incarnations, how mental habits and emotional patterns persist across deaths and rebirths, and how conscious beings create their own suffering through ignorance about the nature of reality. The second phase involves visions of other beings' past lives and karmic connections. Siddhartha develops what Buddhists call the divine eye, the ability to see the entire cosmic web of cause and effect that connects all conscious beings through their choices and experiences. He watches other people and animals being born, living, dying, and being reborn according to their karma, understanding the precise mechanisms that govern how consciousness moves through different forms of existence. This isn't abstract philosophical knowledge. Siddhartha is experiencing direct perception of metaphysical processes that most religious traditions describe only through faith or doctrine. He's seeing how the universe actually works at the level of consciousness and karma, understanding the laws that govern rebirth, suffering, and liberation with the same clarity that a scientist might understand physical laws. But the most revolutionary vision comes at dawn during what Buddhists call the third watch of the night. Siddhartha has his final and most important insight, the understanding of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path that becomes the foundation of Buddhist psychology and ethics. He sees that all suffering comes from tanha, craving or attachment, and that this craving is based on ignorance about the true nature of self and reality. He understands that what we think of as the self is actually a constantly changing process without any permanent, unchanging essence. He realizes that all phenomena are impermanent, that clinging to anything as permanent creates suffering, and that liberation is possible through developing wisdom, ethical behavior, and mental cultivation. But Siddhartha's insight goes beyond just understanding the causes of suffering. He sees the complete path for eliminating suffering, a systematic program of ethical development, mental training, and wisdom cultivation that can lead any conscious being to the same liberation he's achieving. This becomes the Eightfold Path: right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. When Siddhartha completes his enlightenment experience at dawn, he's become the Buddha, the awakened one. But unlike other religious founders who claim to have received revelations from external divine beings, Buddha taught that his insights came from direct examination of consciousness itself, and that the same awakening was possible for anyone willing to follow the path he discovered. The psychological sophistication of Buddhism was unprecedented in human history. Instead of focusing on worship, ritual, or obedience to divine commands, Buddhism offered practical techniques for examining thoughts, emotions, and perceptions to reduce suffering and increase compassion. The Buddha essentially created the first systematic psychology, providing detailed maps of consciousness and specific practices for mental development. Buddhist meditation techniques that emerged from the Buddha's enlightenment dream include mindfulness practices that help people observe their thoughts and emotions without being overwhelmed by them, concentration practices that develop mental stability and clarity, and insight practices that reveal the impermanent and interdependent nature of all phenomena. The Four Noble Truths that Siddhartha discovered under the Bodhi tree created a complete framework for understanding human psychology and behavior. The first truth acknowledges that suffering is an inherent part of existence. The second truth identifies craving and attachment as the root causes of suffering. The third truth proclaims that suffering can be eliminated by ending craving. The fourth truth provides the Eightfold Path as the method for achieving this liberation. But Buddhism's approach to ending suffering wasn't just individual therapy. It included comprehensive social ethics based on understanding the interconnectedness of all beings. Buddhist teachings about karma, compassion, and interdependence created moral frameworks that influenced politics, economics, and social organization throughout Asia. The impact of Buddha's enlightenment dream was enormous and lasting. Buddhism spread throughout Asia over the next several centuries, influencing art, philosophy, science, and ethics in China, Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia, Tibet, and eventually the Western world. Buddhist universities became centers of learning that preserved and developed knowledge in fields ranging from medicine to astronomy. Buddhist concepts about the nature of mind and reality influenced the development of Hindu philosophy, contributed to Chinese Taoist thinking, and eventually reached Europe through trade routes and scholarly exchange. The psychological insights that emerged from Buddha's tree-sitting dream provided tools for mental development that are still being validated and refined by contemporary neuroscience and psychology. Modern brain imaging studies of Buddhist meditation practitioners have confirmed many of the claims about mental training that emerge from Buddha's enlightenment experience. Long-term meditators show increased activity in brain regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and compassion. They demonstrate improved abilities to manage stress, process emotions, and maintain mental clarity under difficult circumstances. The Buddhist emphasis on impermanence and interdependence has influenced contemporary scientific thinking about ecology, systems theory, and quantum physics. Many modern scientists and philosophers have found Buddhist concepts helpful for understanding complex phenomena that can't be explained through traditional Western approaches that assume permanent, independent entities. Buddhist approaches to ethics and social organization have influenced contemporary movements for social justice, environmental protection, and conflict resolution. The emphasis on compassion for all beings, understanding the causes of suffering, and working to eliminate harm has inspired activists and politicians who are trying to create more just and sustainable societies. But what makes Buddha's enlightenment dream unique and religious history is that it didn't create a faith-based religion that required belief in external supernatural authorities. Instead, Buddhism offered a psychological technology that anyone could use to investigate consciousness and reduce suffering through direct experience and mental training. The Buddha explicitly encouraged people to test his teachings through their own practice rather than accepting them on faith. He created what might be the first empirical approach to spiritual development, emphasizing direct observation and experiential verification rather than dogmatic belief or institutional authority. Buddhist communities that emerged from the Buddha's enlightenment insights developed some of the most egalitarian and democratic religious institutions in the ancient world. While Buddhism wasn't completely free from hierarchy and inequality, it was far more inclusive than most contemporary religious traditions, welcoming people from different social classes and providing opportunities for spiritual development regardless of birth circumstances. The monastic communities that preserved and transmitted Buddhist teachings created some of the most sophisticated educational institutions in ancient Asia. Buddhist monasteries became universities where subjects ranging from logic and debate to medicine and astronomy were taught alongside meditation and ethics. Buddhist art and literature that emerged from contemplating the Buddha's enlightenment experience include some of the most psychologically sophisticated explorations of consciousness, emotion, and human motivation in world culture. Buddhist poetry, sculpture, and painting often depict states of mind and spiritual experiences with remarkable subtlety and insight. The philosophical traditions that developed from analyzing the Buddha's enlightenment insights created some of the most rigorous and sophisticated logical systems in human intellectual history. Buddhist philosophers like Nagarjuna and Dignaga developed approaches to reasoning, language, and knowledge that influenced intellectual development throughout Asia and eventually Europe. Contemporary Western psychology and psychotherapy have been significantly influenced by Buddhist concepts and practices that originated from the Buddha's tree-sitting dream. Mindfulness-based therapies, acceptance-based treatments, and compassion-focused interventions all draw on insights that can be traced back to Siddhartha's enlightenment experience. The environmental movement has found inspiration in Buddhist teachings about interdependence and the interconnectedness of all life forms. The understanding that emerged from Buddha's enlightenment about how individual actions affect the broader web of existence has provided frameworks for thinking about ecological responsibility and sustainable living. But perhaps the most important legacy of Buddha's enlightenment, dream, is the demonstration that human consciousness has capacities for understanding and transformation that exceed what most people imagine possible. The Buddha's achievement under the Bodhi tree showed that individuals could develop unprecedented levels of wisdom, compassion, and mental clarity through systematic practice and investigation. Modern neuroscience research on meditation and consciousness has begun to validate many of the claims about mental development that emerged from the Buddha's enlightenment experience. Studies show that sustained meditation practice can literally rewire the brain in ways that increase emotional regulation, attention, and empathy while reducing anxiety, depression, and reactive patterns. The Buddha's enlightenment dream also established the principle that spiritual insight should manifest as psychological health and social benefit rather than just personal salvation or religious experience. Buddhist emphasis on reducing suffering for all beings created a model for engaged spirituality that combines inner development with compassionate action. When your dreams about the nature of consciousness create a systematic psychology that influences billions of people across 2,500 years and provides mental training techniques that are still being validated by contemporary science, you're dealing with a nocturnal insight that transcends individual enlightenment to become a permanent contribution to human knowledge about the mind and its possibilities. The Buddha's tree-sitting dream reminds us that consciousness has depths and capacities that most of us never explore, and that individual psychological breakthroughs can provide benefits not just for the person who achieves them, but for entire civilizations seeking to understand the nature of mind, suffering, and the possibility of profound mental transformation. Now, let's talk about a dream that literally saved the foundation story of Christianity. The night Joseph had a vision that convinced him not to divorce Mary when he discovered she was pregnant, setting up the entire narrative of Jesus' divine conception and birth. And when I say this dream was crucial, I mean that without Joseph's nocturnal visit from an angel, there would be no Christmas story, no nativity scenes, and possibly no Christian theology of incarnation as we know it today. Picture this: you're a carpenter in first-century Palestine, a society where honor and shame determine your entire social standing, and you're engaged to a young woman named Mary who suddenly turns up pregnant. This isn't just socially embarrassing or personally devastating. Under Jewish law, Mary could potentially be stoned to death for adultery, and you could face social ostracism, economic ruin, and permanent disgrace for being associated with what everyone would assume was sexual impropriety. Now, you have to understand the cultural context that makes Joseph's situation so psychologically torturous. In ancient Jewish society, betrothal was much more serious than modern engagement. It was essentially a legal marriage contract that could only be dissolved through formal divorce proceedings. The couple wasn't supposed to live together or have sexual relations until after the wedding ceremony, but they were already considered legally bound to each other. Mary and Joseph's betrothal would have been arranged by their families, probably when Mary was around 12 or 13 years old, which was typical for that time and culture. The engagement period could last up to a year, during which the couple would get to know each other while preparing for married life. Joseph was probably in his late teens or early 20s, working as a tekton, which could mean anything from a carpenter to a stonemason to a general construction worker. As a tekton, Joseph would have been part of the skilled working class, not wealthy, but respectable and capable of supporting a family. His reputation for honest work and moral character would have been essential for his economic survival, since most of his business would come through personal recommendations and community trust. Any scandal involving sexual impropriety could destroy his career and social standing permanently. So, when Mary shows up pregnant, Joseph is facing an impossible situation that threatens to destroy everything he's worked for. He knows he hasn't had sexual relations with Mary, so the child isn't his. Under Jewish law and social custom, he has every right to assume that Mary has been unfaithful and to divorce her publicly, which would shame her and her family but protect his own reputation. But Joseph is also described as a righteous man who doesn't want to disgrace Mary publicly. A public divorce would involve formal accusations of adultery, public testimony about Mary's pregnancy, and social humiliation that could lead to her being ostracized from the community or even facing capital punishment if the religious authorities decided to make an example of her. So Joseph decides on what he thinks is the most compassionate course of action. He'll divorce Mary quietly through private legal proceedings that will end their betrothal without subjecting her to public shame. This would still end their relationship and leave Mary to raise the child alone, but it would save her from the worst social and legal consequences of apparent adultery. But Joseph's decision to divorce Mary, even quietly, represents a massive personal and emotional cost. He's giving up the woman he probably loves, abandoning the future they had planned together, and accepting that he'll need to start over completely in terms of finding a wife and establishing a family. In a society where family connections were crucial for economic and social survival, this represents a devastating loss. Joseph is probably spending sleepless nights wrestling with this decision, wondering if there's any other explanation for Mary's pregnancy, trying to figure out how to handle the situation with maximum compassion for Mary while still protecting his own future and reputation. He's facing the kind of no-win situation that would drive anyone to desperation and exhaustion. But then Joseph has this dream. And it's not a subtle symbolic vision that requires interpretation. It's a direct, unmistakable divine communication that completely reframes his understanding of the situation. An angel appears to him and delivers a message that's both specific and shocking. Joseph, son of David, do not fear to take Mary as your wife, for that which is conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. Now, from a purely human perspective, this is either the most convenient religious vision in history, or Joseph is the most trusting and psychologically resilient man who ever lived. I mean, honey, I know I'm pregnant, but an angel told me it's God's baby, is not typically a story that would convince most fiancés to proceed with marriage plans. But the dream doesn't just explain Mary's pregnancy, it gives Joseph a completely new understanding of his role in what the angel presents as a cosmic plan for human salvation. He's not just being asked to overlook apparent adultery. He's being invited to become the earthly father of the Messiah, the foster parent of God incarnate, the human guardian of the divine child who will redeem humanity. The angel also addresses Joseph specifically as son of David, connecting him to the royal lineage that Jewish prophecy said would produce the Messiah. This isn't random. It suggests that Joseph's genealogy and character make him specifically chosen for this role, that his family background and personal qualities are exactly what's needed for raising the Son of God. Joseph wakes up from this dream completely convinced and transformed. Instead of proceeding with the divorce, He immediately takes Mary as his wife and accepts legal responsibility for the child she's carrying. But think about the psychological courage this requires. Joseph is betting his entire future, his reputation, his economic survival, and his social standing on the reliability of a dream. He's also accepting a role that no human being has ever been asked to play before. How do you raise a child who you believe is the Son of God? What kind of parenting approach do you use with someone who's supposedly divine? How do you discipline, educate, and guide someone who theoretically knows more about ultimate reality than you do? The psychological impact on Joseph must have been enormous and ongoing. Every interaction with Jesus, from infancy through adolescence to adulthood, would be filtered through his belief that this child was the promised Messiah. When Jesus displayed unusual wisdom, performed acts that seemed miraculous, or demonstrated spiritual insights that exceeded normal human development, Joseph would have to process these experiences through the framework provided by his dream. But Joseph also had to maintain the family's normal social functioning while harboring this cosmic secret. He couldn't tell his neighbors, extended family, or business associates that he believed he was raising the Son of God. He had to continue working as a carpenter, paying taxes, participating in community life, and dealing with everyday problems while secretly believing that the ultimate destiny of humanity was unfolding in his household. The social pressures must have been intense and persistent. People in their community would have known when Mary became pregnant and when she gave birth. They would have counted months, done the math, and drawn conclusions about the circumstances of Jesus' conception. Joseph would have faced whispers, suspicious looks, and probably direct questions about the timing of Mary's pregnancy. Joseph's dream-inspired decision to accept Mary and Jesus also established crucial theological principles that became central to Christian doctrine. His willingness to serve as Jesus' legal father created the genealogical connection to King David that established Jesus' messianic credentials according to Jewish prophecy. Without Joseph's adoption, Jesus wouldn't have had the royal lineage that Christians believed was necessary for the Messiah. The dream also established the theological concept of the virgin birth, which became fundamental to Christian beliefs about Jesus' divine nature. Joseph's acceptance of the angel's explanation for Mary's pregnancy provided the foundation for later Christian doctrines about the incarnation, the belief that God became human while remaining divine. But Joseph's role went beyond just providing legal and social legitimacy for Jesus. He served as Jesus' human father figure, teaching him practical skills, providing moral guidance, and modeling what it meant to be a faithful, hardworking, responsible man. The influence of Joseph's character and values on Jesus' development would have been profound and lasting. Christian tradition holds that Joseph taught Jesus the carpenter trade, which means that the Son of God spent years learning practical skills, working with his hands, and understanding the challenges faced by ordinary working people. This connection to manual labor and the working class became an important aspect of Jesus' ministry and his ability to relate to people from all social backgrounds. Joseph's dream-inspired acceptance also created a model for faith that became central to Christian spirituality, the willingness to trust divine guidance even when it contradicts human logic and social expectations. Joseph's decision to believe his vision and act on it, despite the personal costs, became an example of the kind of faith that Christianity would ask of its followers. The broader impact of Joseph's dream extended far beyond his personal situation to influence fundamental aspects of Christian theology and practice. The nativity stories that emerged from Joseph's acceptance of his vision became some of the most beloved and influential narratives in Christian culture, inspiring countless works of art, literature, and music over 2 millennia. Christmas celebrations throughout the Christian world are essentially annual commemorations of Joseph's dream and his decision to trust divine guidance over social convention. Every nativity scene, Christmas pageant, and holiday tradition celebrates the moment when a working-class carpenter chose to believe an impossible story about divine conception and committed his life to protecting and raising the Son of God. But Joseph's story also raises complex questions about faith, trust, and the relationship between divine will and human agency that continue to challenge Christian theologians and believers. How do you distinguish between genuine divine communication and wishful thinking? What are the appropriate limits of faith when it conflicts with reason and social pressure? Joseph's willingness to base his most important life decisions on a dream created a precedent for Christian mysticism and the belief that God continues to communicate with ordinary people through visions, dreams, and spiritual experiences. Many Christian saints and reformers have claimed to receive divine guidance through dreams, often pointing to Joseph's example as validation for their own spiritual experiences. The psychological courage that Joseph demonstrated in acting on his dream has inspired countless individuals facing difficult decisions where moral conviction conflicts with social pressure or personal cost. Joseph's example suggests that sometimes the right choice requires believing in possibilities that exceed normal human experience or logical explanation. But Joseph's dream also highlights the social and economic vulnerability that can result from following religious conviction. By accepting Mary and Jesus, Joseph chose a path that probably subjected his family to ongoing gossip, suspicion, and social marginalization. Christian tradition holds that Joseph died before Jesus began his public ministry, possibly from the stress and hardship of his difficult role. The economic implications of Joseph's decision were also significant. Raising a child who wasn't biologically his own in a society that placed enormous emphasis on bloodline and inheritance would have created ongoing financial and legal complications. Joseph's commitment to Jesus represented a form of adoption that went far beyond normal family obligations. Joseph's role as Jesus' earthly father also influenced Christian thinking about masculinity, fatherhood, and the relationship between human and divine authority. His example of protective, nurturing, self-sacrificing fatherhood became a model for Christian men trying to understand their roles within families and communities. Catholic tradition has particularly emphasized Joseph's role as a model of faithful obedience, quiet service, and trust in divine providence. Saint Joseph became the patron saint of workers, fathers, and people facing difficult decisions where faith must overcome fear and uncertainty. The theological implications of Joseph's dream extend to fundamental questions about the relationship between divine intervention and human freedom. Did Joseph have a real choice about accepting Mary and Jesus, or was his dream a form of divine coercion that made refusal impossible? How does divine guidance interact with human agency and moral responsibility? Protestant traditions have generally emphasized Joseph's faith and voluntary obedience as examples of proper Christian response to divine calling. His decision to trust God despite impossible circumstances became a model for believers, facing situations where following religious conviction requires personal sacrifice and social risk. Orthodox Christian traditions have focused on Joseph's role in protecting and preserving the Holy Family during their vulnerable early years. His willingness to accept social shame and economic hardship to fulfill divine purposes became an example of how ordinary people can participate in cosmic redemption through faithful service. Modern Christian psychology and counseling often reference Joseph's experience when helping people process religious experiences, family challenges, and decisions where faith conflicts with practical considerations. His example suggests that authentic religious experience can provide guidance and strength for dealing with complex personal and social problems. But Joseph's dream also represents one of the earliest examples of how religious visions can reshape family structures and social relationships in ways that challenge conventional expectations. His acceptance of Mary and Jesus created a non-traditional family that became the foundation for an entirely new understanding of kinship, adoption, and spiritual community. The feminist implications of Joseph's dream are also significant. His decision to trust Mary's account of her pregnancy and protect her from social condemnation represents an unusual example of male support for female spiritual experience in a patriarchal society. Joseph's faith in Mary's vision, as well as his own, demonstrated respect for women's religious authority that was uncommon in ancient cultures. Contemporary discussions about adoption, blended families, and non-biological parenting relationships often reference Joseph's example as demonstrating that love, commitment, and spiritual connection can be more important than genetic relationships in creating authentic families. When your dream about accepting an impossible pregnancy creates the foundation story for a religion followed by over 2 billion people and establishes theological principles that influence art, culture, law, and family relationships across 20 centuries. You're dealing with a nocturnal vision that transcends personal decision-making to reshape human understanding of faith, family, and divine intervention. Joseph's dream reminds us that sometimes the most important religious and social transformations begin with ordinary people making extraordinary choices based on spiritual experiences that exceed normal human logic, and that individual acts of faith can create ripple effects that influence the course of human civilization for millennia. The carpenter's dream about divine pregnancy shows us that personal, religious experiences can serve as catalysts for collective transformation, demonstrating how individual trust and spiritual guidance can create new possibilities for understanding the relationship between human and divine, between personal choice and cosmic purpose, between ordinary life and ultimate meaning. Let's end with what might be the most architecturally detailed religious dream in history, Jacob's vision of a ladder reaching from earth to heaven, which transformed him from a scheming younger son into Israel, the patriarch of the Jewish people, and established one of the most enduring symbols of divine human connection in world religion. And when I say this dream changed everything, I mean it literally created the spiritual and ethnic identity of the Jewish people and provided a blueprint for understanding how the sacred intersects with ordinary reality. Picture this, it's sometime around 2000 BC in the ancient Near East, and Jacob is on the run from what might be the world's first major case of sibling rivalry gone wrong. He's just pulled off what has to be one of the most audacious acts of deception in biblical history, tricking his elderly, blind father Isaac into giving him the blessing that was supposed to go to his older twin brother Esau, the rightful heir who should have inherited the family's wealth, status, and divine covenant. Now, you have to understand the context that makes Jacob's situation so desperate and psychologically complex. This isn't just about money or inheritance. It's about a divine promise that goes back to his grandfather Abraham. God had supposedly told Abraham that his descendants would become a great nation, inherit the land of Canaan, and serve as a blessing to all humanity. This covenant was supposed to pass from Abraham to Isaac to Esau as the firstborn son. But Jacob, whose name literally means heel grabber or supplanter, has been scheming to steal this blessing his entire life. He was born grasping Esau's heel, as if trying to pull his twin brother back into the womb so he could be born first. As they grew up, Esau became a skilled hunter and outdoorsman who was clearly their father's favorite, while Jacob was more of a homebody who spent his time around the tents and became his mother Rebekah's preferred son. The family dynamics were toxic and dysfunctional in ways that would make modern family therapists weep. Isaac favored Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game that his older son brought home from hunting expeditions. Rebekah favored Jacob and actively encouraged his schemes to undermine his brother's inheritance rights. The parents were essentially using their children as pawns in their own marital conflicts and personal preferences. Jacob's first major coup occurred when Esau came home exhausted and starving from a hunting trip and agreed to sell his birthright to Jacob in exchange for a bowl of lentil stew. This was legally binding but morally questionable. Jacob took advantage of his brother's momentary hunger to acquire rights that should have been Esau's by birth order and cultural tradition. But the blessing from their father was even more important than the birthright, because it would formally transfer the divine covenant and patriarchal authority to the next generation. Isaac was old, blind, and apparently near death, so he decided to give this crucial blessing to Esau before he died. He asked Esau to hunt some wild game and prepare his favorite meal as part of the blessing ceremony. This is where Rebekah and Jacob implement their most elaborate deception. While Esau is out hunting, Rebekah prepares goat meat to taste like wild game and helps Jacob disguise himself as his brother. Since Esau was notoriously hairy while Jacob had smooth skin, they covered Jacob's arms and neck with goat skins to fool Isaac's sense of touch. Jacob puts on Esau's clothes to smell like his brother and brings the fake meal to his father. The deception works perfectly. Isaac is confused because Jacob's voice sounds different, but the touch and smell convince him that he's blessing. Esau, He gives Jacob the most important blessing in ancient Near Eastern culture: authority over his brothers, prosperity in agriculture and livestock, political dominance over other nations, and most importantly, continuation of God's covenant promise to Abraham. But just as Jacob finishes receiving this stolen blessing, Esau returns from his hunting trip and discovers what's happened. The scene that follows is heartbreaking. Esau breaks down weeping and begs his father for any remaining blessing, asking repeatedly, "Have you not reserved a blessing for me?" Isaac can only offer him a secondary blessing that essentially makes him subordinate to his younger brother. Esau's rage is immediate and murderous. He announces his intention to kill Jacob as soon as their father dies, which could happen at any time given Isaac's apparent illness. Rebekah overhears this threat and realizes that her favorite son's life is in immediate danger. She quickly arranges for Jacob to flee to her brother Laban's house in Haran, supposedly to find a wife among their relatives, but really to escape Esau's vengeance. So Jacob sets out on what must be one of the most psychologically torturous journeys in ancient literature. He's leaving behind everything he's ever known: his family, his home, his inheritance, his social identity, all because of his own scheming and deception. He's won the blessing he wanted, but at the cost of losing his family and becoming a homeless fugitive who might be murdered by his own brother. Jacob is traveling alone, through dangerous territory with nothing but the clothes on his back and probably a small amount of food and water. This is the ancient Near East, where traveling alone meant risking attack by wild animals, bandits, or hostile tribes. He has no military escort, no caravan for protection, and no clear idea of how long it will take to reach his destination or whether his uncle will even welcome him. But the psychological burden is probably worse than the physical dangers. Jacob has to be wrestling with enormous guilt about what he's done to his family. He's destroyed his relationship with his brother, deceived his dying father, and forced his mother to choose between her sons. The blessing he worked so hard to obtain has turned out to be a curse that's cost him everything else he valued. Jacob is also probably questioning whether his actions have disqualified him from the divine covenant he stole. Even if God had intended the blessing for him rather than Esau, did his methods of obtaining it violate divine will? Has he gained the promise of becoming a great nation while losing any chance of actually fulfilling that promise? After traveling for what was probably several days, Jacob stops for the night in a place that seemed completely unremarkable, just a patch of wilderness where he can find some shelter and rest. He's exhausted, emotionally devastated, and probably wondering if he's made the biggest mistake of his life by abandoning his home and family for an uncertain future in a foreign land. Jacob uses a stone as a pillow, which tells you something about how desperate his situation has become. This isn't camping for fun. This is a homeless man trying to survive in the wilderness while fleeing from a family member who wants to kill him. He's probably cold, hungry, scared, and completely alone for the first time in his life. But then Jacob has this incredible dream that completely transforms his understanding of his situation and his destiny. He sees a massive ladder stretching from the ground where he's sleeping all the way up to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it like they're commuting between earth and the divine realm. This isn't a metaphorical or symbolic vision, Jacob describes, seeing actual angelic beings moving up and down this ladder in what appears to be regular traffic between heaven and earth. The ladder itself is substantial enough to support multiple angels simultaneously, suggesting a permanent connection between the divine and earthly realms rather than just a temporary spiritual experience. At the top of the ladder, God speaks to Jacob directly, and the message completely reframes his situation. Instead of being condemned for his deception or abandoned because of his moral failures, Jacob receives confirmation that the covenant promise is indeed his. God promises him that his descendants will inherit the land where he's sleeping, that they'll become as numerous as the dust of the earth, and that all nations will be blessed through his family line. But God also gives Jacob personal promises that address his immediate fears and anxieties. God promises to be with him wherever he goes, to protect him during his journey, and to bring him back safely to his homeland. This isn't just a cosmic covenant about future generations. It's personal assurance for a scared, guilty, homeless man who desperately needs to know that he hasn't destroyed his own destiny through his schemes. When Jacob wakes up, he's terrified and amazed in equal measure. He realizes he's been sleeping on sacred ground, the place where heaven and earth connect, where divine and human realms intersect. The spot where he thought he was just camping for survival turns out to be one of the most holy places in creation. Jacob's response is immediate and transformative. He takes the stone he used as a pillow and sets it up as a monument, pouring oil on it to consecrate it as a sacred marker. He names the place Bethel, which means house of God, recognizing that he's discovered a location where divine presence is accessible to human beings. But Jacob also makes a vow that reveals how completely this dream has changed his understanding of his relationship with God. He promises that if God fulfills the protection and provision promised in the vision, then he'll acknowledge God as his deity, return to this place for worship, and give a tenth of everything he acquires to divine service. This vow is psychologically crucial because it shows Jacob moving from a transactional relationship with God to genuine faith and commitment. Instead of trying to manipulate divine favor through his own schemes, he's accepting that his future depends on divine faithfulness rather than human cleverness. The psychological transformation that Jacob experiences through this dream is enormous and lasting. He's no longer just a clever younger son trying to get ahead through trickery and deception. He's become someone chosen by God to father a great nation, someone whose personal destiny is connected to cosmic, divine purposes that exceed anything he could achieve through his own efforts. But the broader impact of Jacob's dream shaped all of subsequent Jewish history and identity. This vision established the covenant between God and the Jewish people, created the spiritual significance of the land of Israel, and provided the foundation for Jewish beliefs about being chosen for a special relationship with the divine. The ladder itself became one of the most powerful and enduring symbols in religious art and literature, representing the connection between heaven and earth, the possibility of communication between human and divine realms, and the idea that certain places and people can serve as bridges between the sacred and ordinary worlds. Christian tradition interpreted Jacob's ladder as a prophetic symbol of Jesus Christ, who serves as the ultimate connection between divine and human nature. Islamic tradition includes Jacob's vision in its sacred history, and sees the ladder as representing the spiritual ascent that faithful believers can achieve through proper religious practice. But Jacob's dream also established crucial theological principles about divine grace and human destiny that influenced Jewish thinking for thousands of years. The vision demonstrated that God's promises don't depend on human perfection or moral achievement. Jacob receives the covenant despite his deception and moral failures, suggesting that divine purposes can work through flawed human beings. The dream also created the concept of sacred geography that became central to Jewish religious identity. Bethel became a major pilgrimage site and center of worship, and the idea that certain locations could serve as special points of contact between heaven and earth influenced Jewish temple construction and religious practice. Jacob's transformation from supplanter to Israel, which happens later in his story, represents one of the most dramatic character developments in biblical literature. The dream at Bethel begins this process by showing Jacob that his identity and destiny are defined by divine choice rather than human scheming. The ongoing impact of Jacob's ladder dream can be seen in Jewish liturgy, where the vision is regularly recited and celebrated as a foundational moment in Jewish spiritual history. The image of angels ascending and descending has inspired countless interpretations about the relationship between prayer and divine response, between human action and heavenly approval. Jewish mystical traditions have developed elaborate interpretations of Jacob's ladder as representing different levels of spiritual consciousness and divine emanation. Kabbalistic texts describe the ladder as symbolizing the various stages of spiritual ascent that human souls can achieve through study, prayer, and ethical behavior. The architectural influence of Jacob's ladder can be seen in synagogue and temple design throughout Jewish history. Many sacred buildings incorporate vertical elements, stairways, and ascending patterns that reference Jacob's vision and suggest the possibility of spiritual elevation and divine connection. But Jacob's dream also influenced broader cultural understanding of social mobility. spiritual aspiration, and the relationship between earthly achievement and divine approval. The phrase Jacob's ladder has been used to describe everything from economic advancement to artistic achievement to scientific discovery. American folk music traditions include numerous songs about Jacob's ladder that connect the biblical vision to themes of social justice, spiritual struggle, and the hope for transcendence from difficult circumstances. African American spirituals particularly embraced the ladder imagery as representing escape from slavery and oppression. The psychological insights embedded in Jacob's dream have influenced therapeutic approaches to guilt, family conflict, and identity transformation. Jacob's experience suggests that people can overcome their past mistakes and develop new identities based on purpose and divine calling rather than being trapped by their failures and family dysfunction. Modern dream interpretation often references Jacob's ladder as an example of how religious visions can provide psychological integration and spiritual direction during periods of crisis and transition. The dream came to Jacob when he was most vulnerable and psychologically desperate, suggesting that spiritual insights often emerge during times of greatest need. The theological implications of Jacob's dream continue to influence contemporary discussions about divine election, human agency, and the relationship between personal behavior and spiritual destiny. Jacob's receipt of divine blessing, despite his moral failures, raises ongoing questions about grace, forgiveness, and the criteria for divine favor. Jewish-Christian dialogue often focuses on different interpretations of Jacob's ladder and what it reveals about the nature of divine revelation and spiritual truth. Both traditions recognize the vision as foundational, but understand its implications differently for contemporary religious practice and belief. The ecological and environmental movement has found inspiration in Jacob's recognition of Bethel as sacred space, suggesting that human beings have obligations to recognize and protect places where the divine presence can be encountered. The vision implies that the natural world contains locations of special spiritual significance that deserve reverence and care. Contemporary architecture and urban planning sometimes reference Jacob's ladder when designing spaces intended to inspire spiritual reflection and connection with transcendent values. The vertical symbolism of the vision continues to influence how sacred and civic buildings are conceived and constructed. But perhaps the most enduring impact of Jacob's dream is its demonstration that individual spiritual experiences can establish collective religious identity and cultural foundations that last for millennia. Jacob's personal encounter with the divine became the basis for Jewish national identity and religious self-understanding. The latter vision also established the principle that divine communication can occur in unexpected places and circumstances, suggesting that spiritual revelation isn't limited to formal religious settings or specially qualified individuals. Jacob's experience implies that ordinary people in ordinary locations can encounter the sacred in ways that transform both personal destiny and collective history. Jacob's dream reminds us that some religious visions serve as hinges upon which entire civilizations and cultural traditions turn, creating symbols, beliefs, and practices that continue to influence human spiritual development and religious understanding across thousands of years. When your dream about a ladder to heaven establishes the spiritual foundation for one of the world's major religions, creates enduring symbols of divine human connection, and influences art, literature, theology, and cultural identity across 40 centuries, you're dealing with a nocturnal vision that transcends personal psychology to become a permanent contribution to human understanding of the sacred. Jacob's ladder dream shows us that individual encounters with the divine can create collective meaning and cultural identity that far exceeds what any person could achieve through conscious planning or deliberate effort, demonstrating the mysterious ways that spiritual experience can serve as a bridge between personal transformation and historical change. The fleeing brother's vision of angelic traffic between heaven and earth established one of humanity's most powerful metaphors for spiritual aspiration and divine accessibility, proving that sometimes the most important religious insights come to people when they're most vulnerable, displaced, and in need of hope that their lives can have meaning and purpose beyond their current circumstances. Let me tell you about a 14-year-old peasant girl whose dreams transformed a forgotten grotto in southern France into one of the most visited pilgrimage sites in the world, where millions of people still come seeking miraculous healing. And when I say this teenager's visions changed everything, I mean they created a global phenomenon that brings over 5 million visitors annually to a small French town that would otherwise be completely unknown. Picture this. It's February 11th, 1858, and Bernadette Soubirous is gathering firewood with her sister and a friend near what's basically a garbage dump outside the town of Lourdes in southern France. Bernadette comes from the kind of poverty that's hard to imagine today. Her family has been evicted from their mill and is living in a single room that used to be a jail cell. They can barely afford food, let alone proper clothing or heating during the harsh Pyrenees winter. Bernadette herself is small for her age, frequently ill with asthma and other health problems that come from malnutrition and poor living conditions. She can't read or write, speaks primarily in the local Gascon dialect rather than proper French, and has been working since childhood to help support her family. This is not someone who would normally be taken seriously by church authorities or educated adults. But while her companions cross a small stream to gather wood, Bernadette stays behind because she's afraid the cold water will trigger one of her asthma attacks. That's when she hears what sounds like wind in the trees, except there's no wind. She looks up and sees something that will change her life forever. A beautiful young woman dressed in white and blue, standing in a grotto that had been used as a garbage dump. The woman is described by Bernadette as incredibly beautiful, appearing to be about 16 or 17 years old, wearing a white dress with a blue sash and having a golden rose on each foot. She's holding a rosary and appears to be surrounded by light. But here's what's fascinating. The woman speaks to Bernadette in Gascon, the local dialect, rather than in French or Latin as church visions typically did. This first vision lasts only a few minutes, but it's so vivid and compelling that Bernadette is immediately convinced she's seen something supernatural. When she tells her sister and friend, they're skeptical but intrigued enough to return to the grotto with her a few days later. The woman appears again, and this time Bernadette brings holy water to test whether the vision is divine or demonic. Over the next several months, Bernadette has 18 separate visions of this woman, who gradually reveals more information about her identity and purpose. The lady asks Bernadette to pray for sinners, requests that a chapel be built at the grotto site, and eventually reveals herself as the Immaculate Conception, a title that refers to the Catholic doctrine that Mary was conceived without original sin. But the most dramatic and historically significant vision occurs on February 25th, when the lady tells Bernadette to drink from the spring and wash in it. The problem is that there's no spring at the grotto, just muddy ground that sometimes gets wet from rain runoff. But Bernadette follows the instructions, digging in the mud with her hands until a small trickle of water appears. Everyone watching thinks Bernadette has lost her mind. She's digging in the dirt, drinking muddy water, and claiming that an invisible woman told her to do it. Local authorities and church officials are convinced that she's either mentally ill or perpetrating some kind of hoax for attention. But the small trickle of water that Bernadette uncovers gradually becomes a flowing spring that produces thousands of gallons of clear water daily. The psychological impact on Bernadette was enormous and complicated. On one hand, these visions gave her a sense of purpose and divine calling that transformed her from an insignificant peasant girl into someone with a direct connection to the Mother of God. On the other hand, they subjected her to intense scrutiny, skepticism, and sometimes hostility from authorities who didn't believe her claims. Church officials initially tried to discourage the visions, fearing that they were either fraudulent or diabolical. They subjected Bernadette to extensive questioning, psychological evaluation, and theological examination to determine whether her experiences were authentic divine communications or the product of mental illness, trickery, or demonic deception. But Bernadette's consistency, sincerity, and the physical evidence of the spring convinced many people that something supernatural was occurring. She never changed her story despite intense pressure, never asked for money or special treatment, and continued to live in poverty even as her visions became famous throughout France and beyond. The spring that Bernadette discovered following her vision's instructions soon became associated with miraculous healings. People who drank the water or bathed in it reported cures from various illnesses and disabilities. While many of these claims were never medically verified, some cases were so dramatic and well documented that they attracted the attention of physicians and scientists. The Catholic Church initially approached these healing claims with skepticism and caution, but eventually established a rigorous process for investigating alleged miracles at Lourdes. The Church requires extensive medical documentation, multiple physician examinations, and proof that healings are immediate, complete, and medically inexplicable before recognizing them as miraculous. To date, the Catholic Church has officially recognized 70 miraculous healings at Lourdes, though thousands more people claim to have experienced physical or spiritual healing there. The Church's careful approach to miracle verification has actually enhanced, rather than diminished, Lourdes' reputation as a site of authentic supernatural activity. The development of Lourdes as a pilgrimage destination was rapid and dramatic. Within a few years of Bernadette's visions, thousands of people were traveling to the grotto seeking healing and spiritual renewal. The French railway system built special lines to accommodate pilgrimage traffic, and the town was transformed from a rural backwater into an international religious destination. Bernadette herself was somewhat overwhelmed by this development. She had expected her visions to be a private spiritual experience, not the foundation for a global pilgrimage industry. The constant attention and questioning became so intrusive that she eventually joined a convent to escape the publicity and live a quiet religious life. But the impact of Bernadette's visions extended far beyond religious tourism. Lourdes became a symbol of faith, hope, and the possibility of divine intervention in human suffering. The site attracted not only Catholics, but also people from other religious traditions who were drawn by reports of healing and spiritual renewal. The scientific study of Lourdes' healings has contributed to medical understanding of the relationship between faith, psychology, and physical health. While skeptics argue that reported cures can be explained through placebo effects or misdiagnosis, supporters point to cases where healings appear to exceed what psychological factors alone could achieve. Modern Lourdes receives over 5 million visitors annually, making it one of the most popular religious destinations in the world. The town has developed an extensive infrastructure to support pilgrimage tourism, including hotels, hospitals, and facilities specifically designed to accommodate disabled visitors seeking healing. The economic impact of Bernadette's teenage visions on the region has been enormous. Lourdes is now one of France's major tourist destinations, supporting thousands of jobs and generating hundreds of millions of euros in economic activity annually. A 14-year-old girl's religious experience literally transformed the economy of an entire region. But Lourdes has also maintained its spiritual character despite the commercial development. The grotto where Bernadette had her visions remains a place of quiet prayer and reflection, and many visitors report profound spiritual experiences regardless of whether they experience physical healing. The psychological and social functions of Lourdes as a pilgrimage site extend beyond individual healing to include community building, cultural exchange, and interfaith dialogue. Pilgrims from around the world gather at Lourdes, creating temporary communities united by shared hope and spiritual seeking. Bernadette's visions have inspired countless works of art, literature, and film that explore themes of faith, healing, and the relationship between the natural and supernatural. Her story has become a cultural touchstone for discussions about religious experience, divine intervention, and the power of individual faith to create collective transformation. The medical facilities at Lourdes have become centers for research into the relationship between spirituality and health. The International Medical Association of Lourdes Studies reported healings using modern scientific methods, contributing to ongoing debates about the role of faith in medical treatment and recovery. But perhaps most importantly, Bernadette's visions demonstrated that divine communication could come through the most unlikely messengers: poor, uneducated, marginalized individuals who had no social authority or religious credentials. Her example challenged traditional assumptions about who could serve as conduits for supernatural revelation. The theological implications of the Lourdes visions have influenced Catholic doctrine and practice in lasting ways. The emphasis on Mary as an intercessor for healing and spiritual renewal, the importance of pilgrimage and communal prayer, and the belief in ongoing divine intervention in human affairs all received reinforcement through Bernadette's experiences. Contemporary pilgrimage to Lourdes includes people seeking healing from modern diseases like cancer, AIDS, and mental illness, demonstrating the ongoing relevance of Bernadette's 19th century visions for 21st century spiritual and medical needs. The site continues to serve as a place where traditional religious practices meet contemporary health challenges. The environmental impact of Lourdes as a pilgrimage destination has also raised questions about sustainable religious tourism and the responsibility of religious sites to protect the natural settings where spiritual experiences occur. The tension between preserving the grotto's sacred character and accommodating millions of visitors continues to challenge site managers. Bernadette's personal legacy extends beyond her visions to include her example of humility, authenticity, and commitment to serving others despite personal cost. She was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, but her appeal crosses denominational boundaries to inspire people seeking to understand how ordinary individuals can become vehicles for extraordinary spiritual transformation. When a teenage peasant girl's visions of a beautiful lady create one of the world's most famous pilgrimage sites and inspire millions of people to seek healing and spiritual renewal, you're dealing with the kind of religious dream that demonstrates how individual mystical experience can generate collective movements that transform cultures, economies, and religious practices across centuries. Joseph Smith claimed to have received visions, beginning at age 14, that led to the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the Book of Mormon. And when I say these dreams were specific and detailed, I mean they included precise instructions about finding golden plates buried in a hill in New York that contained an ancient record of pre-Columbian Americans. His visions were so incredibly detailed and persistent that they created a new branch of Christianity that now has over 16 million members worldwide. Picture this, it's 1820 in rural upstate New York, and 14-year-old Joseph Smith Jr. is living in an area that historians call the burned-over district because it had been swept by so many religious revivals that people joked the spiritual fires had burned over it repeatedly. This was a time and place where religious enthusiasm was common, where new denominations were sprouting up regularly, and where claims about divine revelation were part of the cultural landscape. But Joseph's first vision was different from the typical revival experiences of his era. According to his account, he was praying in a grove of trees near his family's farm, struggling with questions about which church he should join, when he experienced what he described as a literal visitation from God, the Father, and Jesus Christ. This wasn't just a feeling of spiritual peace or a sense of divine presence, Joseph claimed. He saw two distinct personages standing above him in brilliant light, speaking to him audibly about religious truth and his personal destiny. What made Joseph's initial vision psychologically significant was its impact on his understanding of his own role in religious history. The divine figures supposedly told him that none of the existing churches were correct in their doctrines, that the true gospel would be restored through him, and that he would be instrumental in bringing forth ancient scriptures that would clarify religious truth for the latter days. For a teenage farm boy with limited education, this was an overwhelming responsibility and calling. But the vision that really changed everything came 3 years later, in 1823, when Joseph reported being visited by an angel named Moroni, who told him about ancient gold plates buried in a nearby hill. This vision was remarkably specific. Moroni supposedly described the exact location of the plates, the stone box where they were hidden, and the special interpreting stones that would allow Joseph to translate the ancient text written in what the angel called Reformed Egyptian. The angel's instructions were detailed and practical. Joseph was told to go to the hill Cumorah, though he didn't call it that initially, on the autumnal equinox, find a large round stone covering a stone box, and inside he would discover gold plates covered with ancient writing. But Moroni also warned that Joseph wasn't ready to receive the plates yet. He would need to return to the same spot once a year for 4 years, learning and preparing himself spiritually before he would be allowed to take possession of the ancient record. This 4-year waiting period was psychologically crucial for Joseph's development as a religious leader. Each annual visit to the hill provided him with additional visions and instruction from Moroni about his future role as a translator and prophet. Joseph reported receiving detailed information about the ancient civilizations that had supposedly inhabited the Americas, their religious beliefs, their wars and conflicts, and their eventual destruction due to wickedness and internal strife. The specificity of Joseph's visions about the ancient American peoples was remarkable for someone with his limited educational background. He described complex civilizations with advanced military technology, detailed religious ceremonies, and sophisticated political structures that predated European contact by thousands of years. His visions included specific names of individuals, geographical locations, and historical events that would later be incorporated into the Book of Mormon narrative. When Joseph finally received the plates in 1827, the translation process that followed was itself based on visionary experiences. According to witnesses, Joseph would place special stones called the Urim and Thummim into a hat, bury his face in the hat to exclude light, and receive the English translation of the ancient text through divine revelation. This process allowed him to dictate the entire Book of Mormon to scribes without referring to notes or other source materials. The psychological and social impact of Joseph's translation process was enormous. The Book of Mormon, completed in about 65 working days, was a 531-page volume that told the story of ancient American civilizations spanning over 1,000 years. For Joseph's contemporaries, the idea that an uneducated farm boy could produce such a complex work through divine revelation was either miraculous proof of his prophetic calling or evidence of an elaborate fraud. Joseph's visions also included detailed instructions about organizing a new church based on the ancient Christian model described in the New Testament. He reported receiving revelations about church structure, priesthood authority, ordinances like baptism and communion, and specific doctrines that distinguished his restored church from existing Christian denominations. These organizational visions provided the blueprint for creating a religious movement that could sustain itself and grow beyond Joseph's immediate circle of followers. The Book of Mormon that emerged from Joseph's visionary translation process addressed many of the theological and social questions that were prominent in early 19th century America. It included discussions about infant baptism, the nature of the Trinity, the relationship between faith and works, and the destiny of indigenous American peoples that spoke directly to contemporary religious debates. But Joseph's visions extended beyond just translating ancient records to include ongoing revelations about modern church governance, missionary work, and social organization. He reported receiving over 130 revelations during his lifetime, many of which provided specific guidance about practical matters like church finances, settlement patterns, and relationships with government authorities. The establishment of Mormon communities in Ohio, Missouri, and eventually Utah was based on visionary guidance that Joseph claimed to receive about gathering the faithful in specific geographical locations. These revelations included detailed instructions about city planning, economic organization, and social structures that would create what Mormons believed were Zion communities preparing for Christ's second coming. Joseph's visions also included controversial revelations about polygamy, temple ordinances, and the eternal nature of marriage that created distinctive Mormon doctrines and practices. These revelations often came during periods of personal or organizational crisis, providing spiritual solutions to practical problems facing the early church. The psychological impact of Joseph's claims about ongoing revelation was profound for his followers. Unlike traditional Christianity, which generally viewed divine revelation as having ended with the biblical period, Mormonism taught that revelation continued and that their prophet could receive direct communication from God about contemporary issues. This created a religious culture that was both highly authoritarian and remarkably adaptable to changing circumstances. The missionary work that spread Mormon beliefs throughout America and eventually worldwide was based on the conviction that Joseph's visions had restored true Christianity that had been lost for centuries. Mormon missionaries taught that other churches were incomplete or corrupted, and that only through Joseph's restored gospel could people access the full truth about salvation and eternal life. Joseph's martyrdom in 1844, when he was killed by a mob in Illinois, created additional visionary traditions within Mormonism. Many early church members reported dreams and visions of Joseph appearing to them after his death, providing comfort and continued guidance for the church he had founded. These posthumous visionary experiences helped maintain unity and direction during a critical transition period for the Mormon movement. The westward migration of Mormons to Utah under Brigham Young's leadership was guided by visions and revelations that many church members believed continued the pattern of divine communication that had characterized Joseph's ministry. The establishment of Salt Lake City and surrounding Mormon settlements was seen as fulfilling prophecies about gathering the faithful in the mountains of the American West. Modern scholarship on Joseph Smith and early Mormonism has approached his visionary claims from various perspectives, some viewing them as genuine religious experiences, others as products of his cultural environment and psychological makeup, and still others as conscious fabrications designed to create religious authority. But regardless of their ultimate source, there's no denying that Joseph's visions created a religious movement that has profoundly influenced American culture and religious development. The Book of Mormon continues to be studied not just as Mormon scripture, but as a 19th century document that reflects the religious, social, and intellectual concerns of Joseph Smith's era. Scholars have identified numerous parallels between the book's content and contemporary Protestant theology, frontier democracy and popular theories about American Indian, origins that suggest complex relationships between Joseph's visions and his cultural environment. Joseph Smith's visions also contributed to distinctively American approaches to religious authority and revelation that emphasized individual spiritual experience over traditional ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Mormon emphasis on personal revelation and continuing prophecy influenced broader American religious culture and provided a model for other new religious movements that emerged during the 19th century. The psychological profile that emerges from studying Joseph's visionary experiences suggests a complex individual who combined religious enthusiasm with practical leadership abilities, creative intelligence with deep spiritual conviction. His capacity to translate his visions into organized, religious institutions that could survive and grow after his death demonstrates remarkable organizational and inspirational skills. Contemporary members of the LDS Church continue to view Joseph's visions as the foundational events of their religious tradition, emphasizing the ongoing relevance of his teachings and the continuing operation of revelation within their church structure. The centennial celebrations and historical commemorations of Joseph's visions remain central to Mormon religious identity and community life. The broader impact of Joseph Smith's visionary experiences on American religious history extends beyond just creating another denomination to include contributions to religious liberty, westward expansion, and the development of distinctively American forms of Christianity that emphasize progress, revelation, and the special destiny of the American continent in divine plans for human history. When a teenage farm boy's visions about ancient golden plates create a religious movement that influences millions of people worldwide and contributes to the settlement of the American West, you're dealing with the kind of prophetic dreams that demonstrate how individual, spiritual experiences can generate collective movements that reshape entire regions and cultures. Joseph Smith's visionary claims remind us that religious innovation often begins with individuals who report direct communication with the divine, and that these personal revelations can serve as the foundation for institutions and communities that far exceed what any single person could create through purely human effort and imagination. Martin Luther reported having vivid dreams and visions that convinced him the Catholic Church had become corrupted, and that salvation came through faith alone rather than through church sacraments and papal authority. And when I say these dreams were psychologically intense, I mean his most famous vision involved throwing an inkwell at the devil during a theological argument that literally changed the course of Western Christianity and split the church for over 500 years. Picture this, it's 1521. and Martin Luther is hiding in Wartburg Castle under the protection of Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Luther has just been declared a heretic and an outlaw by the Holy Roman, emperor at the Diet of Worms, for refusing to recant his criticisms of Catholic Church practices. He's essentially a dead man walking if he's caught by imperial authorities. So he's been spirited away to this remote castle where he's supposed to lay low and hopefully be forgotten by the religious and political powers that want him eliminated. But Luther isn't the kind of person who can just quietly disappear. He's a brilliant theologian with a passionate, combative personality who has spent years studying Scripture and growing increasingly convinced that the Catholic Church has strayed far from biblical Christianity. His famous 95 Theses, which he posted on the Wittenberg church door in 1517, were just the beginning of what would become a comprehensive challenge to Catholic authority and doctrine. Now, you have to understand the psychological pressure Luther was under during his months at Wartburg Castle. He was cut off from his university, his students, and his colleagues at a time when the Reformation movement he had started was spreading rapidly but also facing violent opposition. Catholic authorities were burning his books and arresting his supporters. He was receiving reports of peasant uprisings that were using his teachings to justify violence against church and secular authorities. Luther was probably wondering whether his theological rebellion had unleashed forces that he couldn't control and that might destroy rather than reform Christianity. Luther was also struggling with intense personal guilt and spiritual anxiety that had plagued him since his early years as a monk. Despite his intellectual confidence about salvation by faith, he continued to experience what he called Anfechtungen, spiritual attacks or temptations. That made him doubt his salvation and question whether his opposition to the church might be inspired by Satan rather than God. It's in this context of isolation, stress, and spiritual crisis that Luther had his most famous religious vision, a dream encounter with the devil that became one of the most dramatic and influential spiritual experiences in Protestant history. According to Luther's own account, he was working late one night in his room at Wartburg Castle, translating the New Testament from Greek into German so that ordinary people could read Scripture in their own language. Luther was wrestling with a particularly difficult passage about the nature of salvation and the role of good works in Christian life when he suddenly became aware that he was no longer alone in his room. The devil appeared to him, not as a terrifying monster, but as a sophisticated theologian who began engaging Luther in complex theological debate about the validity of his criticisms of Catholic doctrine. The dream devil didn't try to tempt Luther with obvious sins like lust, greed, or pride. Instead, he attacked Luther's theological positions with scholarly arguments that challenged the biblical basis for Protestant reforms. The devil argued that the Catholic Church's teaching about salvation through faith plus good works was more balanced and psychologically healthy than Luther's emphasis on salvation by faith alone. But what made this vision psychologically devastating for Luther was that the devil's arguments were genuinely sophisticated and addressed real weaknesses in Protestant theology that Luther himself had been struggling to resolve. The devil pointed out that if salvation came through faith alone, it might encourage moral laziness and antinomianism, the belief that Christians weren't bound by moral law since their salvation was guaranteed regardless of their behavior. The theological debate in Luther's dream continued for what felt like hours, with the devil systematically challenging every major Protestant doctrine that Luther had developed. The devil argued that papal authority provided necessary unity and guidance for Christian communities, that priestly mediation helped ordinary believers access divine grace, and that the Catholic sacramental system offered concrete assurance of salvation that pure faith couldn't provide. Luther found himself intellectually overwhelmed by the devil's arguments and began to doubt whether his opposition to Catholic teaching might actually be harmful to Christian faith and practice. He started wondering whether his personal spiritual struggles with guilt and anxiety had led him to misinterpret Scripture and create theological innovations that would damage rather than help Christian souls. But then Luther had a crucial insight that transformed both his dream and his subsequent theological development. He realized that the devil's arguments, however sophisticated, were based on human wisdom and institutional authority rather than on direct biblical teaching. Even if Protestant doctrine created practical problems, Luther became convinced that faithfulness to Scripture was more important than theological convenience or institutional unity. In his dream, Luther responded to the devil's theological sophistication by grabbing his inkwell and hurling it at his demonic opponent, declaring that he would trust God's word as revealed in Scripture rather than human arguments, no matter how clever or persuasive they might be. The inkwell supposedly left a permanent stain on the wall of Luther's room at Wartburg Castle, and visitors to the castle can still see what tour guides claim is the mark left by Luther's projectile. The psychological impact of this dream on Luther was profound and lasting. It resolved his doubts about the validity of his opposition to Catholic teaching and convinced him that his Reformation efforts were divinely inspired rather than satanically motivated. The dream provided him with the confidence and clarity he needed to continue his theological and institutional reforms despite intense opposition and personal danger. Luther's vision also influenced his understanding of how Christians should respond to spiritual and intellectual challenges to their faith. The inkwell throwing incident became a symbol of faithful resistance to sophisticated arguments that might lead believers away from biblical truth. Luther taught that Christians should respond to theological confusion not with complex reasoning but with simple trust in God's revealed word. The broader impact of Luther's devil vision extended far beyond his personal spiritual development to influence the entire Protestant Reformation movement. Luther's conviction that he had received divine confirmation of his theological positions gave him the authority and confidence to continue challenging Catholic doctrine even when faced with excommunication, imperial condemnation, and threats of execution. Luther's experience at Wartburg Castle also produced the first complete German translation of the New Testament, which became one of the most influential books in German cultural history. His translation work was partly motivated by his conviction, reinforced by his devil dream, that ordinary people needed direct access to Scripture rather than depending on church authorities for theological interpretation. The vision influenced Luther's approach to theological education and pastoral care throughout the rest of his career. He emphasized the importance of biblical literacy for all Christians and developed educational programs that would enable ordinary believers to read and understand Scripture for themselves. This democratization of religious knowledge became one of the most revolutionary aspects of Protestant Reformation. Luther's devil encounter also shaped Protestant attitudes towards spiritual warfare and the ongoing conflict between divine truth and satanic deception. Protestant traditions developed elaborate theologies about how Christians should recognize and resist demonic influences on their theological thinking and spiritual development. The psychological insights that Luther gained from his castle vision influenced his approach to counseling other believers who were struggling with doubt, guilt, and spiritual anxiety. He developed what might be called the first Protestant psychology, emphasizing the importance of faith, scripture study, and community support for maintaining spiritual health and theological clarity. Luther's vision became a model for later Protestant leaders who claimed to receive divine guidance about church reform and theological development. The emphasis on direct divine communication rather than institutional authority became a characteristic feature of Protestant spirituality that distinguished it from Catholic approaches to religious authority. The artistic and cultural impact of Luther's devil encounter can be seen in countless paintings, sculptures, and literary works that depict the dramatic scene of the reformer throwing his inkwell at Satan. The image became an iconic representation of Protestant resistance to Catholic authority and the willingness of faithful believers to oppose even supernatural opposition to biblical truth. But Luther's vision also created ongoing theological problems for Protestant Christianity that continue to challenge reformers today. If individual believers could receive direct divine guidance about theological questions, how could Protestant communities maintain doctrinal unity and institutional authority? Luther's emphasis on personal spiritual experience opened the door for endless theological fragmentation and denominational proliferation. The political implications of Luther's vision were also significant for European history. His conviction that he had divine support for opposing Catholic authority encouraged other political leaders to challenge papal power and assert national independence from Roman control. The Protestant Reformation that Luther's visions helped inspire contributed to centuries of religious warfare and political conflict in Europe. Contemporary Protestant denominations continue to grapple with the legacy of Luther's spiritual experiences and their implications for church authority, biblical interpretation, and individual spiritual development. The tension between personal revelation and institutional order that Luther's visions created remains one of the central challenges of Protestant ecclesiology. Modern psychological analysis of Luther's devil encounter has suggested various explanations for his visionary experience, including stress-induced hallucinations, sleep deprivation, and the psychological projection of his internal conflicts about challenging religious authority. But regardless of the neurological mechanisms involved, there's no denying that Luther's vision had enormous historical and cultural consequences. The environmental impact of Luther's castle experience can still be seen at Wartburg Castle, which has become a major pilgrimage destination for Protestant Christians and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The room where Luther claimed to have his devil encounter attracts thousands of visitors annually who come to see the supposed inkwell stain and reflect on the theological struggles that changed Christian history. Educational institutions throughout the Protestant world continue to study Luther's spiritual experiences as foundational examples of how individual religious conviction can challenge institutional authority and create lasting social change. His vision provides a model for understanding how personal spiritual insights can serve as catalysts for collective transformation. But perhaps most importantly, Luther's devil vision demonstrates how individual psychological struggles with doubt, guilt, and spiritual anxiety can be transformed into sources of theological insight and social reform that benefit entire religious communities. His dream shows that personal spiritual crises can serve as catalysts for broader religious and cultural renewal. When your dream about arguing theology with the devil creates the foundation for Protestant Christianity and influences the spiritual lives of hundreds of millions of people across 5 centuries, you're dealing with the kind of visionary experience that transcends individual psychology to reshape religious institutions and cultural traditions. Luther's inkwell-throwing vision reminds us that sometimes the most important religious insights come through dramatic personal encounters with spiritual opposition, and that individual willingness to trust divine revelation over human authority can create movements that transform entire civilizations. Now let's slow down a bit and explore the fascinating historical and scientific framework behind religious dreams, because once you understand how different cultures throughout history have interpreted divine visions, and what modern science tells us about the psychology and neurology of religious experience, tonight's stories stop seeming like random, miraculous events and start looking like windows into fundamental aspects of human consciousness, spiritual development, and the mysterious ways that individual psychological experiences can reshape entire civilizations. The thing about religious dreams is that they represent one of the most consistent and universal phenomena in human history, appearing in every culture, every historical period, and every religious tradition we know about. From the earliest Mesopotamian dream tablets to contemporary reports of divine visions, human beings have consistently reported receiving spiritual guidance, religious revelations, and direct communication with supernatural beings through their dream experiences. What makes this universality particularly fascinating is that religious dreams seem to follow remarkably similar patterns across completely different cultures and time periods. Whether you're looking at ancient Egyptian pharaohs, medieval Christian mystics, or modern Pentecostal believers, the basic structure of religious dream experiences remains surprisingly consistent, suggesting that there might be fundamental aspects of human consciousness and brain function that make us naturally receptive to spiritual experiences during sleep. Let's start with ancient Mesopotamia, where some of the oldest recorded religious dreams in human history were carefully documented on cuneiform tablets that archaeologists have been discovering and translating for over a century. Mesopotamian cultures, including the Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians, developed incredibly sophisticated systems for interpreting religious dreams that recognized their potential to provide divine guidance for both individual believers and entire kingdoms. Mesopotamian dream interpretation distinguished between several different types of religious experiences, including dreams where gods appeared directly to communicate with humans, dreams that provided prophetic information about future events, and dreams that offered guidance about religious rituals and moral behavior. They understood that not all dreams were religiously significant, but they also recognized that certain types of dream experiences could provide access to divine wisdom that exceeded normal human knowledge. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest literary works, includes several crucial religious dreams that guide the hero's spiritual development and provide him with divine assistance during his quest for immortality. These dreams aren't just narrative devices, they reflect genuine, Mesopotamian beliefs about how gods communicated with humans and how dream experiences could provide access to supernatural knowledge and power. Mesopotamian kings regularly consulted dream interpreters before making important political and military decisions. Understanding that divine guidance received through dreams could determine the success or failure of their policies and campaigns. The famous Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's dreams, which are recorded in the biblical book of Daniel, represent typical examples of how ancient Near Eastern rulers relied on dream interpretation for state governance. But Mesopotamian culture also developed careful criteria for distinguishing between authentic divine communication and ordinary, psychological dreams that didn't carry religious significance. They understood that not every dream was a message from the gods, and they created elaborate classification systems for identifying the specific characteristics that indicated genuine divine revelation. Ancient Egypt took religious dream interpretation even further, developing what might be the most sophisticated ancient system for understanding divine communication through sleep experiences. Egyptian dream interpretation texts, some of which survive on papyrus scrolls that are over 4,000 years old, reveal incredibly detailed approaches to analyzing religious dreams and applying their guidance to both personal spiritual development and state administration. Egyptian culture understood religious dreams as direct communications from the gods that could override earthly authority and provide divine solutions to problems that exceeded human wisdom. Pharaohs regularly received divine guidance through dreams, and these experiences were considered so important that they were often recorded in official royal inscriptions and incorporated into temple decorations and religious ceremonies. The Egyptians also developed elaborate dream incubation practices where people could visit temple complexes specifically designed to facilitate religious dream experiences. These sacred sites included special sleeping chambers, purification rituals, and priestly guidance that helped ordinary citizens receive divine guidance about personal problems, health issues, and spiritual development. Egyptian medical papyri include detailed instructions for interpreting religious dreams related to health and healing, suggesting that ancient Egyptian physicians understood psychological and spiritual factors as crucial components of medical treatment. Dreams about gods like Thoth, Isis, and Imhotep were considered important diagnostic information that could guide therapeutic interventions and predict treatment outcomes. But Egyptian dream interpretation also recognized the political and social implications of religious visions. Dreams that challenged pharaonic authority or predicted political upheaval were carefully analyzed to determine whether they represented genuine, divine warnings or potentially seditious psychological projections that needed to be suppressed or redirected. Ancient Greek culture approached religious dreams through philosophical frameworks that emphasized their psychological and spiritual significance rather than just their predictive or practical value. Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle wrote extensively about dreams as windows into the soul's relationship with divine truth, developing theoretical approaches that influenced Western thinking about religious experience for over 2 millennia. The Greek oracle traditions at sites like Delphi Dodona and Epidaurus were essentially institutionalized systems for facilitating and interpreting religious dream experiences. The famous Pythia at Delphi would enter trance states that often included visionary dreams, providing divine guidance for individuals and city-states throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. Greek medical traditions associated with Hippocrates and later Galen also recognized religious dreams as important sources of diagnostic and therapeutic information. The cult of Asclepius, the god of healing, centered around dream incubation practices where sick people would sleep in temple complexes and receive divine guidance about their medical conditions through dream experiences. But Greek culture also developed critical approaches to religious dreams that distinguish between genuine divine communication and psychological experiences that might be influenced by physical health, emotional state, or social expectations. Greek philosophers created some of the earliest systematic approaches to evaluating religious claims and determining the reliability of spiritual experiences. Roman culture inherited and expanded upon Greek approaches to religious dreams while also developing distinctively Roman attitudes toward divine communication that emphasized practical utility and political application. Roman religious dreams often focused on military strategy, political decision-making, and the maintenance of state authority rather than just personal spiritual development. Roman historical writers like Livy, Tacitus, and Suetonius documented numerous examples of religious dreams that influenced major political and military decisions throughout Roman history. These accounts reveal that Roman leaders regularly relied on divine guidance received through dreams for everything from battle tactics to legislative policy, understanding that supernatural insights could provide crucial advantages in competitive political environments. But Roman culture also developed skeptical traditions that questioned the reliability of religious dreams and warned against allowing supernatural claims to override rational analysis and practical judgment. Roman philosophers like Cicero and Lucretius wrote critically about religious dream interpretation, arguing that many supposed divine communications were actually products of human psychology rather than genuine supernatural revelation. Early Christian approaches to religious dreams were profoundly influenced by Jewish biblical traditions that included numerous examples of divine communication through sleep experiences. The Hebrew Bible contains dozens of accounts of prophets, kings, and ordinary believers receiving crucial guidance from God through dreams, establishing religious dreams as fundamental components of authentic spiritual experience. Christian interpretation of religious dreams emphasized their role in divine revelation and their potential to provide guidance that exceeded human wisdom and understanding. Early Christian communities expected that believers would regularly receive divine communication through dreams, and they developed theological frameworks for distinguishing between dreams that came from God, dreams that reflected human psychology, and dreams that might be influenced by demonic forces. The early Christian church also inherited Jewish traditions of dream interpretation that emphasized the symbolic and metaphorical dimensions of religious visions rather than just their literal content. Christian theologians like Origen and Augustine wrote extensively about the spiritual significance of religious dreams and their role in individual spiritual development and community guidance. But early Christianity also had to navigate complex questions about religious authority and the relationship between individual spiritual experience and institutional church leadership. If ordinary believers could receive direct divine communication through dreams, how should this personal revelation relate to official church teaching and ecclesiastical authority? Medieval Christian culture developed incredibly sophisticated approaches to religious dreams that balanced respect for individual spiritual experience with concern for doctrinal orthodoxy and institutional unity. Medieval theologians created detailed criteria for evaluating religious dreams and determining whether they represented authentic divine communication or potentially dangerous spiritual deceptions. Medieval monasticism placed enormous emphasis on religious dreams as important components of spiritual development and mystical experience. Monastic communities developed elaborate practices for cultivating receptivity to divine communication through dreams, including specific dietary protocols, prayer schedules, and sleeping arrangements designed to facilitate religious vision experiences. Medieval Christian mystical traditions produced some of the most detailed and psychologically sophisticated accounts of religious dreams in human history. Figures like Hildegard of Bingen, Julian of Norwich, and Meister Eckhart described complex Visionary experiences that combine theological insight with profound psychological understanding of consciousness, spiritual development, and the relationship between individual experience and divine truth. But medieval Christianity also developed careful safeguards against religious dreams that might challenge church authority or lead believers into heretical thinking. The medieval church created institutional procedures for evaluating claims about divine revelation and determining whether supposed religious dreams were consistent with orthodox Christian teaching. Islamic approaches to religious dreams were profoundly shaped by the Quranic accounts of prophetic revelation and the Islamic understanding of divine communication through human consciousness. Islamic culture developed elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding religious dreams that distinguish between true divine revelation, symbolic guidance, and ordinary psychological dreams. Islamic scholars created detailed classification systems for religious dreams that identified different types of divine communication and provided guidance about how each type should be interpreted and applied to spiritual development and community life. These classification systems influenced Islamic mystical traditions and provided foundations for Islamic approaches to spiritual direction and religious counseling. Sufi mystical traditions within Islam developed particularly sophisticated approaches to religious dreams that emphasize their role in spiritual purification and direct experience of divine reality. Sufi masters created elaborate training programs that included dream work as essential components of mystical education and spiritual development. But Islamic culture also emphasized the importance of distinguishing between authentic religious dreams and psychological experiences that might be confused with divine communication. Islamic religious law developed specific criteria for evaluating claims about divine revelation and determining the religious significance of supposed spiritual experiences. Buddhist approaches to religious dreams were distinctive in their emphasis on the psychological mechanisms underlying visionary experiences rather than their supernatural origins. Buddhist psychology developed detailed analyses of consciousness that explained religious dreams as expressions of karmic patterns, mental conditioning, and the practitioner's stage of spiritual development. Buddhist meditation traditions created systematic approaches to lucid dreaming and conscious exploration of visionary states that allowed practitioners to investigate the nature of religious experience through direct observation rather than just faith or theological speculation. These practices contributed to Buddhist understanding of consciousness and mental development that anticipated many modern psychological insights. But Buddhism also maintained that the ultimate goal of spiritual practice was to transcend dependence on external religious experiences, including dreams in favor of direct realization of enlightened consciousness that didn't require supernatural intervention or divine communication. Hindu traditions developed perhaps the most elaborate and psychologically sophisticated approaches to religious dreams in human history, creating detailed taxonomies of visionary experience that connected dream content to specific stages of spiritual development, karmic patterns, and relationships with various deities and spiritual forces. Hindu yoga and meditation traditions included extensive practices for cultivating and interpreting religious dreams as components of comprehensive spiritual training programs. These practices recognized that religious dreams could provide valuable guidance and inspiration, while also warning against becoming attached to visionary experiences rather than pursuing deeper spiritual realization. Hindu philosophical traditions also developed sophisticated theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between consciousness, divine reality, and the various forms of experience, including dreams through which spiritual truth could be accessed and understood. Modern scientific approaches to religious dreams have provided fascinating insights into the neurological and psychological mechanisms that might underlie spiritual vision experiences. Contemporary neuroscience has identified specific brain regions and neural networks that become active during mystical experiences, including the temporal lobe, the default mode network, and areas associated with self-transcendence and altered consciousness. Brain imaging studies of people who report religious visions have found consistent patterns of neural activity that suggest genuine neurological phenomena rather than simple imagination or psychological delusion. These studies have identified changes in brain chemistry, electrical activity, and connectivity patterns that correlate with reports of divine communication and spiritual revelation. Research on meditation and contemplative practices has revealed that sustained spiritual disciplines can literally rewire the brain in ways that make religious dream experiences more likely and more vivid. Long-term meditators show increased activity in brain regions associated with attention, emotional regulation, and self-transcendence, along with enhanced connectivity between normally separate neural networks. Contemporary psychology has also identified various factors that seem to increase the likelihood of having religiously significant dreams, including periods of intense stress or crisis, major life transitions, sustained contemplative practice, and strong cultural expectations about divine communication. These findings suggest that religious dreams often emerge during periods when people are most psychologically receptive to spiritual experience, and most in need of guidance that exceeds ordinary human resources. The therapeutic value of religious dreams has been recognized by psychologists working with trauma, addiction, existential crisis, and spiritual development. Many people report that religious visions help them process difficult experiences, develop resilience, and find meaning and purpose during challenging life circumstances. Modern research has also revealed interesting patterns in the content and timing of religious dreams across different cultures and religious traditions. While the specific details vary according to cultural and theological expectations, the underlying psychological structure of religious dream experiences shows remarkable consistency that suggests universal aspects of human consciousness and spiritual development. Cross-cultural studies have found that religious dreams tend to occur most frequently during periods of social stress, cultural transition, and religious revival, suggesting that spiritual vision experiences might serve adaptive functions for both individuals and communities facing uncertainty and change. Contemporary neuroscience has also identified relationships between religious dream experiences and various forms of creativity, problem-solving, and psychological integration that suggests these visions might serve important cognitive and emotional functions beyond their purely spiritual significance. The study of religious dreams has contributed to broader understanding of consciousness, memory, and the relationship between sleep and creativity that has implications for education, therapy, and human development that extend far beyond purely religious applications. But perhaps most importantly, modern research has confirmed that religious dreams represent genuine psychological phenomena that can have profound impacts on individual development and social change, regardless of whether they involve actual supernatural communication or emerge from purely natural brain processes. The scientific study of religious dreams has also revealed important insights about the relationship between individual psychological experience and collective cultural development, showing how personal spiritual visions can serve as catalysts for broader social transformation and religious innovation. Contemporary research continues to explore the mechanisms underlying religious dream experiences while also recognizing their ongoing significance for human spiritual development and cultural evolution. The scientific approach to religious dreams emphasizes empirical investigation, while also acknowledging the profound personal and social meaning that these experiences continue to have for billions of people worldwide. When we understand religious dreams as expressions of fundamental aspects of human consciousness rather than just supernatural anomalies, we can appreciate their role in psychological development, cultural innovation, and the ongoing human quest for meaning, purpose, and connection with transcendent reality that continues to shape individual lives and collective civilization. The historical and scientific understanding of religious dreams ultimately reveals them as bridges between individual consciousness and collective meaning, between personal psychology and cultural transformation, between natural brain processes and experiences that feel profoundly supernatural, reminding us that some of the most important aspects of human experience exist at the intersection of science and spirituality, psychology and transcendence, individual vision, and collective truth. Let me share some truly obscure facts about religious dreams that most people have never heard, but that reveal fascinating insights about the hidden connections between divine visions, collective consciousness, and the mysterious ways that spiritual experiences have shaped human civilization in ways that challenge our basic assumptions about how religious innovation actually works. First obscure fact, and this one will make you question everything. You think you know about medieval religious life and the sophisticated systems that monastic communities developed for sharing and coordinating divine revelations across vast geographical distances during the 12th and 13th centuries. Benedictine monasteries throughout Europe participated in what might be the most extensive network of synchronized religious dreaming in recorded history, with monks in different countries, reporting identical divine visions on the same nights, often involving detailed instructions about theological questions, liturgical reforms, and even political events that hadn't yet occurred. This phenomenon was first documented by Abbot Suger of St. Denis, who began noticing that monks under his supervision were reporting remarkably similar dreams about proposed changes to church architecture, monastic discipline, and approaches to contemplative prayer. Initially, Suger assumed these were coincidences or the result of informal communication between monasteries. But as he began corresponding with other abbots throughout France, England, and the German territories, he discovered that the synchronized dreams were occurring across distances that made normal communication impossible. The network became formalized around 1147 when Abbot Bernard of Clairvaux, one of the most influential religious figures of his era, established what he called Satellitatis Somniorum Sanctorum, the Fellowship of Sacred Dreams. This secret organization connected over 200 Benedictine monasteries across Europe through a system of dream sharing and collective interpretation that operated completely outside official church channels. The fellowship developed elaborate protocols for documenting and verifying synchronized religious dreams, requiring multiple independent witnesses, detailed written reports submitted before dream outcomes could be confirmed, and statistical analysis to determine whether reported synchronizations exceeded what would be expected from random chance. These procedures were remarkably sophisticated for the 12th century, anticipating modern research methodologies by several centuries. Over a period of nearly 200 years, the fellowship documented over 15,000 cases of synchronized religious dreams involving monks in different monasteries who experienced identical or nearly identical divine visions on the same nights. The most compelling cases involved monks who had never met and were separated by hundreds of miles, yet reported receiving identical instructions about specific theological questions, liturgical practices, or interpretations of Scripture. One particularly well-documented case from 1189 involved 47 monks in different English monasteries who all reported having identical dreams about the Third Crusade on the same night that Richard the Lionheart was making his final decision to take the cross. The dreamers provided detailed descriptions of military strategies, diplomatic negotiations, and even specific battles that wouldn't occur until months later, all of which proved remarkably accurate when the actual crusade unfolded. Another extraordinary case involved 38 monks in various French monasteries who simultaneously dreamed about a new approach to Gregorian chant that would enhance its spiritual effectiveness and emotional impact. The musical innovations that emerged from these collective dreams became the foundation for what we now know as the Notre Dame School of Polyphony, one of the most important developments in medieval musical history. The fellowship's research revealed that synchronized religious dreams seem to occur most frequently during periods of theological controversy, political upheaval, or spiritual crisis affecting the broader Christian community. The monks documented increased synchronization during debates about scholastic philosophy, conflicts between secular and religious authority, and periods of religious reform that challenged established church practices. But perhaps most remarkably, the fellowship discovered that synchronized religious dreams often provided solutions to theological and practical problems that exceeded the individual knowledge and experience of any participating monks. The collective dreams seem to access what the medieval documents describe as sapientia universalis, universal wisdom that transcended normal human learning and intellectual capacity. The theological implications of these synchronized dreams created significant challenges for medieval church authority. If groups of monks could receive direct divine guidance about theological questions and church practices, how should this collective revelation relate to official papal teaching and ecclesiastical hierarchy? The fellowship operated in secrecy partly because their discoveries challenged traditional assumptions about religious authority and divine communication. The network was eventually disbanded around 1378. During the Great Western Schism, when political divisions within the Church made international monastic cooperation impossible, most of the fellowship's records were sealed and hidden in various monastery libraries throughout Europe, with instructions that they not be opened until church unity was restored and theological scholarship was advanced enough to properly evaluate their findings. These archives were gradually discovered and studied during the 19th and 20th centuries, revealing one of the most extensive systematic investigations of collective religious experience in recorded history. Modern researchers have been unable to fully explain the mechanisms that might account for the documented cases of synchronized dreaming, but statistical analysis confirms that the reported synchronizations far exceeded what would be expected from coincidence or fraud. Contemporary studies of collective consciousness, morphic resonance, and non-local communication have provided new theoretical frameworks for understanding how the synchronized religious dreams documented by the fellowship might be possible. While the mechanisms remain mysterious, the medieval research contributed to establishing scientific foundations for investigating collective psychological and spiritual phenomena. The legacy of the Fellowship of Sacred Dreams continues to influence contemporary research into group meditation, collective prayer, and shared spiritual experiences. Their documentation of synchronized religious dreams provides compelling evidence that contemplative practices might facilitate forms of consciousness that transcend individual psychological boundaries and enable access to collective spiritual wisdom. Second obscure fact, and this one involves experimental religious psychology that was centuries ahead of its time. The 9th century Islamic philosopher Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq al-Kindi, known in the West simply as al-Kindi, secretly established what might be the world's first systematic laboratory for studying prophetic dreams at the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, using controlled environments and experimental techniques to induce and analyze religious visions that provided remarkably accurate predictions about political events, scientific discoveries, and theological developments. Al-Kindi had become fascinated with prophetic dreams after studying accounts of the Prophet Muhammad's revelations and observing that many of his own students at the House of Wisdom reported receiving mathematical and philosophical insights through dream experiences. He theorized that prophetic consciousness might operate according to natural principles that could be understood and systematically cultivated rather than depending entirely on unpredictable divine intervention. Starting around 850 CE, Al-Kindi established a secret research program that recruited volunteer subjects who were willing to undergo experimental procedures designed to induce prophetic dream states under carefully controlled conditions. The research was conducted in absolute secrecy because both religious and political authorities would have viewed systematic attempts to produce prophetic dreams as potentially heretical and politically dangerous. The experimental facility was hidden beneath the main library of the House of Wisdom, in chambers that Al-Kindi had specially designed to eliminate external sensory input while providing optimal conditions for achieving the altered states of consciousness that seemed to facilitate prophetic dreaming. The research chambers included precise temperature and humidity controls, carefully calibrated lighting systems, and acoustic environments designed to promote specific brainwave patterns. Al-Kindi's research protocol was remarkably sophisticated for the 9th century, incorporating systematic observation, controlled variables, and statistical analysis that anticipated modern experimental psychology by over 1,000 years. Volunteer subjects would undergo preparatory training that included specific dietary regimens, breathing exercises, and meditation techniques designed to enhance their receptivity to prophetic visions. The experimental sessions themselves involved elaborate procedures for inducing dream states while maintaining continuous observation and documentation of the subject's physical and psychological responses. Al-Kindi developed instruments for measuring pulse, respiration, and body temperature during prophetic dream experiences, creating detailed records of the physiological correlates of visionary consciousness. But the most remarkable aspect of Al-Kindi's research was the apparent accuracy of the prophetic information that emerged from his experimental dream sessions. His laboratory notes, discovered in 1962 hidden beneath the ruins of the original House of Wisdom, document hundreds of cases where subjects received specific information about future events that proved accurate when later verified against historical records. One extraordinary case involved a series of experimental sessions in 867 CE, where multiple subjects reported identical dreams about the eventual fall of the Abbasid Caliphate and the rise of new Islamic powers in Egypt and Spain. These dreams included specific details about political leaders, military strategies, and cultural developments that wouldn't occur until the 10th and 11th centuries, yet proved remarkably accurate when the predicted events actually unfolded. Another remarkable series of experiments produced prophetic dreams about scientific discoveries that wouldn't be made until centuries later. Subjects reported visions of mathematical principles, astronomical observations, and medical knowledge that exceeded the best scholarship available in 9th century Baghdad, yet anticipated developments that would emerge during the later Islamic Golden Age and the European Renaissance. Al-Kindi's research also revealed that prophetic dreaming seemed to be enhanced by specific combinations of intellectual preparation, spiritual practice, and environmental conditions that could be systematically reproduced and refined through experimental iteration. His laboratory developed increasingly effective techniques for facilitating accurate, prophetic visions through controlled manipulation of physical and psychological variables. The theological implications of Al-Kindi's research were profound and potentially revolutionary for Islamic understanding of prophecy and divine revelation. His experiments suggested that prophetic consciousness might be a natural human capacity that could be cultivated through appropriate training and environmental conditions rather than being limited to specially chosen prophets and religious authorities. But Al-Kindi's research also raised disturbing questions about the nature of time, causation, and divine omniscience that challenged both Islamic theology and Aristotelian philosophy. If human beings could systematically access information about future events, what did this mean for concepts of divine sovereignty, human free will, and the relationship between natural and supernatural causation? The research program was discontinued around 885 CE when political instability in Baghdad made it impossible to maintain the laboratory facilities and continue the experimental work safely. Most of the documentation was hidden to protect both the research findings and the identities of subjects who had participated in the controversial experiments. Al-Kindi's experimental work influenced his philosophical writings about the relationship between human reason and divine revelation, contributing to his development of innovative approaches to Islamic philosophy that attempted to reconcile Aristotelian logic with Quranic teachings about prophecy and divine knowledge. Modern researchers who have studied Al-Kindi's laboratory notes recognize his prophetic dream experiments as remarkably advanced for their time, incorporating methods and insights that wouldn't be formally developed by psychology and parapsychology until the 20th century. His research anticipated contemporary investigations into precognition, remote viewing, and altered states of consciousness by over a millennium. Contemporary neuroscience and consciousness research have provided new frameworks for understanding how the phenomena that Al-Kindi studied might be possible, including theories about quantum consciousness, non-local correlation, and the relationship between consciousness and time that suggest his experimental results might reflect genuine features of human mental capacity rather than just coincidence or fraud. The legacy of Al-Kindi's prophetic dream research continues to influence contemporary Islamic approaches to spiritual psychology and contemplative practice. His example demonstrates how rational investigation and spiritual experience can be combined in ways that enhance rather than diminish both scientific understanding and religious insight. Third obscure fact, and this one challenges our understanding of how collective trauma affects religious consciousness and the mysterious ways that shared suffering can generate synchronized spiritual experiences that provide comfort and guidance during humanity's darkest periods. During the Black Death pandemic of the 14th century, European chroniclers documented an unprecedented outbreak of religious dreams featuring direct appearances of Jesus Christ that seemed to predict the plagues. Progression, provide specific medical guidance, and offer spiritual comfort to communities facing mortality rates that sometimes reach 60% of the population. The phenomenon began around 1347 in the Mediterranean port cities where the plague first entered Europe through infected ships arriving from Central Asia. Initially, individual cases of Christ vision dreams were reported by clergy and devout laypeople who interpreted them as personal spiritual consolation during the crisis. But within months, entire communities throughout Europe were experiencing what chroniclers described as Visio Christi Universalis, universal visions of Christ that seem to transcend individual psychology and represent collective divine communication. The dreams typically followed remarkably consistent patterns, regardless of the geographical location or social background of the dreamers. Christ would appear as a figure of overwhelming compassion and divine authority, often showing the wounds of crucifixion but radiating healing light that seemed to provide protection against the plague's devastation. He would deliver specific messages about survival strategies, community organization, and spiritual preparation that proved remarkably practical and effective for helping communities cope with the pandemic. But what made these Christ dreams truly extraordinary was their apparent, prophetic accuracy about the plague's spread and development. Dreamers throughout Europe reported receiving detailed information about which regions would be affected next, how long local outbreaks would last, and which communities would suffer the highest mortality rates. This prophetic information often proved accurate enough that some communities were able to prepare for the plague's arrival and implement protective measures that reduced their death rates. The medical guidance that emerged from these collective Christ visions was also remarkably advanced for 14th century understanding of disease transmission and treatment. Dreamers reported receiving instructions about quarantine procedures, sanitation practices, and herbal remedies that proved more effective than conventional medical treatments available at the time. Some of these divine medical recommendations wouldn't be formally recognized by European medicine until centuries later. Giovanni Boccaccio, the famous Italian writer who survived the plague in Florence, documented several cases where Christ vision dreams provided specific guidance about avoiding infection and caring for plague victims that saved hundreds of lives in his community. He noted that the divine medical advice was often more practical and effective than the treatments recommended by university-trained physicians. The social and psychological functions of these collective Christ dreams extended far beyond medical guidance to include community, organization, and spiritual resilience that helped European society maintain some degree of coherence during the pandemic. The shared visions created bonds of mutual support and collective purpose that enabled communities to continue functioning despite catastrophic mortality rates. Religious authorities initially approached these widespread Christ visions with suspicion and concern, fearing that claims about direct divine communication might challenge church authority or lead to heretical movements. But the practical effectiveness of the guidance received through the dreams, combined with their orthodox theological content, eventually convinced many church leaders that the visions represented authentic divine intervention during humanity's greatest crisis. The theological implications of the plague period Christ dreams were profound for medieval Christian understanding of divine providence and the relationship between suffering and salvation. The vision suggested that God was providing direct guidance and comfort to ordinary believers during their time of greatest need, even when official church institutions were overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. But the dreams also raised complex questions about why divine intervention was occurring during the plague when it seemed absent during other periods of human suffering. Some theologians interpreted the Christ visions as evidence that the Black Death represented a unique moment in salvation history when direct divine communication was necessary to help humanity survive an unprecedented existential threat. The cultural impact of these collective religious dreams influenced European art, literature, and religious practice for centuries after the plague ended. Many of the most famous medieval and Renaissance depictions of Christ emphasize his role as healer and comforter, reflecting the widespread cultural memory of his appearance during the Black Death to provide guidance and solace during humanity's darkest hour. The chroniclers who documented the plague period Christ dreams noted that the visions seemed to occur most frequently in communities that maintained strong traditions of communal prayer and mutual support despite the pandemic's social disruption. This suggested that collective spiritual practices might facilitate shared religious experiences that could provide practical guidance and psychological resilience during extreme crises. Modern historians who have studied the Black Death have found that communities with strong religious traditions and social cohesion generally experience lower mortality rates and faster recovery than areas where social institutions collapsed completely during the pandemic. The Christ vision dreams might have contributed to maintaining the spiritual and social resources that enabled survival and recovery. Contemporary research into collective trauma and shared religious experience has provided new frameworks for understanding how the phenomena documented during the Black Death might reflect genuine psychological and social mechanisms rather than just medieval superstition. Studies of disaster survivors have found that shared spiritual experiences often emerge during extreme crises and can provide important resources for individual and community resilience. The relationship between collective trauma and enhanced spiritual sensitivity has been documented in numerous contemporary studies of disaster survivors, war veterans, and other populations that have experienced extreme stress. These findings suggest that the widespread religious dreams during the Black Death might reflect universal human psychological responses to existential threat rather than unique medieval phenomena. But perhaps most remarkably, the specific medical and social guidance that emerged from the plague period Christ dreams demonstrated practical effectiveness that exceeded the best available secular knowledge of the time. This suggests that collective religious experience during extreme crises might somehow provide access to information and insights that transcend normal human knowledge and problem-solving capacity. The legacy of the Black Death Christ visions continues to influence Christian understanding of divine providence, collective prayer, and the role of religious faith in providing practical guidance during times of crisis. The dreams demonstrated that divine communication could serve not just spiritual purposes, but also practical functions that help communities survive and recover from catastrophic challenges. Contemporary pandemic research has found renewed interest in the psychological and social factors that contributed to community resilience during the Black Death, including the role of shared religious experiences in maintaining social cohesion and providing practical guidance for survival. The medieval Christ dreams offer historical precedents for understanding how spiritual resources can contribute to practical outcomes during global health crises. When entire populations simultaneously experience religious dreams that provide accurate prophetic information and practical guidance for surviving humanity's greatest pandemic, you're dealing with collective spiritual phenomena that challenge our understanding of consciousness, divine communication, and the mysterious ways that shared crisis can generate resources for survival that transcend individual human knowledge and capability. The Black Death Christ visions remind us that some religious experiences emerge specifically during humanity's moments of greatest vulnerability and need, suggesting that whatever forces govern spiritual communication might be responsive to collective suffering in ways that provide practical assistance and psychological comfort when traditional institutions and knowledge systems prove inadequate for addressing existential threats. These plague dreams show us that individual religious experience and collective social survival can be intimately connected, demonstrating how personal spiritual visions can serve broader functions for community, resilience, and practical problem-solving that extend far beyond their purely theological significance to become resources for human survival and cultural continuity during civilization's darkest moments. If you're somehow still awake, which I doubt, you've just spent the last 2 hours exploring how human dreams have literally reshaped the spiritual landscape of our entire planet. From Constantine's blazing cross to Muhammad's terrifying encounter with Gabriel, From Buddha's psychological revelations to Jacob's heavenly ladder, we've seen how individual nocturnal visions have created the religious foundations that still guide billions of people today. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how these dreams didn't just inspire personal faith. They transformed entire civilizations, launched empires, sparked wars, and created the cultural frameworks that continue to influence art, law, politics, and human relationships across the globe. Tonight's stories remind us that consciousness is far more mysterious and powerful than we typically realize. Whether you interpret these visions as divine communication, psychological breakthrough, or neurological phenomenon, there's no denying that dreams have served as one of the primary vehicles for spiritual innovation and religious transformation throughout human history. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and whether you've ever had dreams that felt spiritually significant, the kind of visions that left you wondering if you'd experienced something beyond ordinary consciousness. Have you ever woken up feeling like you'd received guidance, insight, or connection to something greater than yourself? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts about the relationship between dreams and spiritual experience. Do you think these religious visions represent genuine contact with the divine? Or are they profound psychological experiences that reveal the incredible creative power of human consciousness? Either way, tonight's stories show us that the line between sleeping and waking, between individual experience and collective transformation, between psychology and spirituality is far more fluid and mysterious than most of us imagine. Sweet dreams, folks. And remember, you never know when your unconscious mind might download the next great spiritual innovation that could change the world. See you in your dreams.